I was still holding the steering wheel when he texted me that he'd thrown my life away. "Your things are in the trash. Go live with your mother." I didn't answer. I didn't call. I just pulled over on the side of County Road 12 right past the old feed store that had been there longer than I'd been alive. My hands stayed on the wheel a second too long, like if I let go, something else would slip with them. Next to me, Mr. Halpern, the notary who had handled my grandfather's affairs for years, shifted in his seat and glanced over. "Why are you crying?" he asked, calm, as if we were discussing the weather. "This is good." I turned to him, not sure I'd heard right. He paused, then said it plainly. "You're the richest woman in this city now." The road ahead blurred, not because I was crying, though I was, but because nothing in my life made sense anymore. Just an hour earlier, I had been standing beside my grandfather's casket, shaking hands with people who had known him longer than I had. Men in pressed shirts and women with quiet voices, all saying the same thing. "He was a good man. He was proud of you." I had nodded politely the way you do at funerals. You accept their words even if you're not sure you deserve them. My grandfather had been the one steady thing in my life. He never raised his voice, never rushed you when you spoke. If you asked him a question, he'd think before answering, sometimes too long. But when he did speak, it mattered. And now he was gone. I'd expected the ride back to be quiet. I hadn't expected my marriage to end before I made it home. I looked down at my phone again. The message was still there. No follow-up, no explanation, just a clean final line. "Your things are in the trash." We had been married 12 years. 12 years reduced to one sentence. "I don't understand," I said finally, my voice rough. Mr. Halpern didn't rush to fill the silence. That was something I'd always noticed about him. He let people catch up to their own thoughts. "You don't understand which part?" he asked. "All of it," I said. "My husband just threw me out of my house. And you're telling me that's good." He folded his hands over the leather folder resting on his lap. It looked old, like everything else about him, worn but not weak. "Your grandfather didn't trust your husband," he said. I let out a short breath. He never said that to me. "He wouldn't," Mr. Halpern replied. "He didn't want to put you in the middle, but he planned for it." That word caught me off guard. "Planned." He nodded once. "Yes, planned." We sat there for a moment, the car idling softly. A truck passed by, its tires humming against the pavement. Life went on as if nothing had shifted. But everything had. "Your grandfather came to see me 3 years ago," Mr. Halpern said. "He asked me to draw up a revised will, not a simple one, a careful one." I swallowed. "Why?" "Because he believed," he said slowly, "that one day you might be left with nothing." The words settled in my chest, heavier than I expected. "That's not fair," I said quietly. "He didn't even know my husband that well." Mr. Halpern gave me a look not unkind but steady. "He knew people," he said, "better than most." I looked back out at the road. The feed store sign swayed slightly in the wind. It hadn't been repainted in years, but it was still standing. My grandfather used to take me there when I was a kid, said a place that lasts tells you something about how it's run. I wondered what he would say now. "What does any of this have to do with me being rich?" I asked, the word feeling strange in my mouth. Mr. Halpern tapped the folder lightly. "This," he said. I stared at it like it might explain itself. "Your grandfather's estate is substantial," he continued. "Land investments, business interests, more than most people in this town realize." I shook my head. "He lived in the same house for 40 years. He drove that old truck." "Exactly," Mr. Halpern said. "He didn't spend much. He built quietly." That sounded like him. Still, I couldn't connect it. "And it all goes to me?" I asked. "Yes," he said. I waited for him to add something else, a condition, a complication, something that would make it make sense. He did. "But not all at once," he said. I felt my grip tighten on the wheel again. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, choosing his words carefully, "that your grandfather didn't want to hand you something that could be taken from you." A cold feeling settled in. "Taken by who?" He didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. I thought about my husband Mark standing in our kitchen that morning before the funeral. He hadn't come with me. Said he had work. He always had work lately. "Don't be late," he had told me. "We need to talk when you get back." I had nodded, distracted, thinking about the day ahead, about saying goodbye to my grandfather. I hadn't asked what he wanted to talk about. Maybe I hadn't wanted to know. "He's been under pressure," I said, more to myself than to Mr. Halpern. "Mark. His business hasn't been doing well. He's been stressed. That may be true, Mr. Halpern said evenly, but your grandfather's concern wasn't about stress. Then what was it about? He looked at me for a long moment. Control, he said. The word hung there. I thought about the bank accounts I didn't check anymore because Mark handled them. The bills I didn't see. The way he'd started making decisions without asking, then explaining them after the fact like it was simpler that way. I had told myself it was partnership. That's what you do in a marriage, I thought. You trust. I never signed anything I said, suddenly the thought rising sharp and fast, not without reading it. Mr. Halpern gave a small nod. And that, he said, is exactly why your grandfather's plan still stands. I turned to him. What plan? He opened the folder. Inside were documents neatly arranged, each one marked and tabbed. This is the trust your grandfather created, he said, and the condition attached to it. My heart began to beat a little faster. What condition? He met my eyes. That it would only become fully active, he said, if you were ever put in a position where you had nothing left. I let out a slow breath. Nothing left, I repeated. Yes. I looked down at my phone again, at the message. Your things are in the trash. It didn't feel like anger anymore, or even sadness. It felt like something else. Something quieter. So you're telling me, I said, my voice steadier now, that because my husband just threw me out, I get everything? Mr. Halpern closed the folder gently. I'm telling you, he said, that your grandfather made sure you would never truly be left with nothing. I sat there letting that sink in. The wind picked up outside, rustling the dry grass along the roadside. For the first time since I'd read that message, I wasn't thinking about going home. I wasn't even sure I had one anymore. What do I do now? I asked. Mr. Halpern looked straight ahead, then back at me. Now, he said, you decide what your life looks like without asking anyone else for permission. I nodded slowly. The road was still there, same as before. But it didn't feel the same. Nothing did. We didn't head back to my house. Mr. Halpern asked me to turn left instead of right when we reached the next intersection, and I didn't question it. The road curved toward the older part of town where buildings hadn't changed much in decades. Brick fronts, faded signs, places that didn't rush to keep up with anything. His office sat between a closed insurance agency and a barber shop that still had a striped pole out front. I had been there once before, years ago, when my grandfather first updated his will. I remembered the smell, paper leather, and something faintly like old wood. We walked in without speaking. The quiet inside felt different from the quiet in the car, less heavy, more deliberate. Mr. Halpern gestured for me to sit across from his desk. The same desk I remembered. Solid oak, scratches along the edges like it had seen a lot of conversations people didn't want to have. He placed the folder down in front of me but didn't open it right away. Before we go through this, he said, there are a few things you should understand about your grandfather. I gave a small nod. I thought I knew him. You knew him as a grandfather, he said gently. That's not the same as knowing how he moved through the world. I leaned back slightly in the chair. I wasn't sure I liked the sound of that, but I also wasn't sure I had the right to argue. He didn't trust easily, Mr. Halpern continued, but once he did, he didn't waver. That sounds like him, I said quietly. He trusted you, he said. Something about the way he said it made my throat tighten. My grandfather had never said things like that out loud, not in big, obvious ways. He didn't give speeches, didn't sit you down and explain how much you meant to him. But he showed it. When I was 10, he let me help him fix a fence that didn't need fixing. I held nails. He handed me tools I wasn't strong enough to use yet. He didn't rush me, didn't correct me unless it mattered. Take your time, he would say. Do it right once. I carried that with me longer than I realized. Even after I got married, even after I started letting other people decide what right looked like. 3 years ago, Mr. Halpern said bringing me back your grandfather came in and asked for a full review of his estate. I folded my hands together in my lap. That's around when Mark started pushing for us to reorganize things. Mr. Halpern raised an eyebrow slightly. Reorganize how? Joint accounts, I said, consolidating assets. He said it would make taxes easier, more efficient. And did it, he asked. I hesitated. I don't really know, I admitted. He handled most of it. That silence between us said more than any explanation I could have given. Your grandfather noticed the shift, Mr. Halpern said. Not from documents, from behavior. I frowned. He barely saw us together. He didn't need to, he replied. He watched you. That stopped me. What do you mean? He saw how you spoke less when your husband was around, he said. How you deferred, how you checked with him before answering simple questions. I felt a quiet flush of embarrassment even though there was no accusation in his tone. I thought that was just marriage, I said. Sometimes it is, he said. Sometimes it's something else. I looked down at my hands. There were small things I had ignored over the years. Mark correcting me in front of people but calling it helping. Mark insisting on handling the finances because you don't like numbers anyway. Mark deciding when we visited my family how long we stayed, what we contributed. None of it had felt big enough to fight over. But maybe that was the point. Your grandfather didn't believe in confrontation, Mr. Halpern said. He believed in preparation. I let out a slow breath. So he came to you. Yes. And told you my husband was going to throw me out one day, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Not in those exact words, he said. But he believed there was a real possibility that you would be left in a position where you had no control over your own life. I leaned back again, staring at the ceiling for a moment. He never said anything to me, I murmured. He didn't want to create a conflict you weren't ready to see, Mr. Halpern replied. That landed harder than I expected. So instead I said slowly, he built something behind the scenes. Mr. Halpern nodded. Yes, a trust, structured in a way that protects you from external influence. External influence, I repeated. Anyone who might try to benefit from your position without your full understanding or consent, he clarified. That was a careful way of saying it. But I understood. He finally opened the folder. Inside were pages more than I expected, neatly organized, tabs marking sections, notes in the margins in my grandfather's handwriting. That was what got me. Not the legal language, not the numbers I hadn't seen yet. His handwriting. Small, precise, steady. He had gone through this himself. Line by line. For me. This trust holds the majority of his estate, Mr. Halpern explained. Land outside the city, several commercial properties, long-term investments, and a controlling share in a regional supply company. I blinked. A company. Yes, he said. One your grandfather never put his name on publicly. I let out a quiet, almost disbelieving breath. He used to complain about the price of lumber, I said. All the time. Mr. Halpern allowed himself a faint smile. He had a reason to pay attention. I turned a page carefully, like it might disappear if I moved too quickly. How much is all of this? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Enough, he said finally, that you will never have to depend on anyone else again. That wasn't a number. But it was something. And the condition, I asked. You said it doesn't all activate at once. He nodded and pointed to a section halfway through the document. Your grandfather included a clause, he said. A triggering condition. I read the heading. Contingency of loss of control. My stomach tightened. It states, Mr. Halpern continued, that full access to the trust is granted if you are placed in a situation where your primary resident's financial security or legal standing is compromised by a spouse or partner. I looked up at him slowly. That's very specific. Yes, he said. And today, I asked. He met my eyes. Today, he said, your husband informed you that you no longer have access to your home. I thought about the message again. Your things are in the trash. Go live with your mother. That counts, I asked quietly. Mr. Halpern didn't hesitate. Yes. The room felt very still. I looked back down at the document. All those years I had thought of my grandfather as a simple man. Careful, quiet, steady. I hadn't realized how far ahead he had been thinking. He didn't do this to punish your husband, Mr. Halpern said, as if reading my thoughts. He did it to protect you. I nodded slowly. I think I understand that now. And there's something else, he added. I looked up again. What? He closed the folder gently. This isn't just about money, he said. It's about control. I sat with that for a moment. For years I had told myself I was part of a partnership. That we made decisions together. That letting Mark handle certain things was just practical. But sitting there in that quiet office with my grandfather's handwriting in front of me, I could see it more clearly. I had been stepping back, little by little, until there wasn't much left that was mine to decide. What happens next? I asked. Mr. Halpern leaned back slightly in his chair. Next, he said, you decide whether you want to step into what your grandfather prepared for you. I looked at the folder. At the life I hadn't known I had. Then I thought about the house I wasn't sure I could go back to. About the message still sitting on my phone. About the man who had sent it. I think I said slowly, I don't have much of a choice anymore. Mr. Halpern shook his head once. You do, he said. That's the point. I let that settle. Choice. It had been a long time since that word felt real. I didn't go back to the house that day. Mr. Halpern suggested I take a room at the Willow Creek Inn, nothing fancy, just clean quiet and a place where nobody would ask questions. The kind of place people pass through without leaving much behind. It felt right. I parked under a maple tree that had already started to turn even though it was only early fall. The air carried that dry, familiar smell that comes just before the weather shifts. I sat in the car for a moment before going in looking at my phone again. The message was still there. No apology, no follow-up, no explanation. Just a decision made without me. I locked the car and walked inside. The room was simple. A bed, a chair, a small desk, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot and a row of trees beyond it. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time all day there was no one else around. No funeral guests, no passing trucks, no calm voice from the passenger seat explaining what my life had just become. Just me. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees and let the silence settle. Not heavy. Just honest. When I met Mark, he wasn't like this. That's the part people always forget when they hear stories like mine. They assume it was obvious from the beginning, that there were signs you ignored because you wanted to. But it didn't feel that way at the time. He was steady, confident, the kind of man who seemed to know what he was doing even when things got complicated. I had just started working at the accounting office downtown. I liked the work, but I wasn't sure where it would lead. Mark made things feel certain. He talked about plans, about building something together, about not having to worry all the time. That last part mattered more than I realized. We got married 2 years later. Nothing extravagant. A small ceremony. My grandfather stood beside me, quiet as always. He didn't say much that day, but I remember the way he looked at Mark. Not cold, not unkind. Just measuring. At the time I told myself he was just being protective. Now I wasn't so sure. The first few years were easy. Or at least they felt that way. We both worked. We shared expenses. We talked about buying the house instead of renting. Mark handled most of the financial planning, but I didn't mind. Numbers never made me nervous, but they didn't excite me either. He said he enjoyed it. Let me take care of that, he would say. You've got enough on your plate. It sounded like support. I let it be that. The changes didn't happen all at once. They never do. It started with small things. Mark opening my mail by accident and then explaining what it was so I didn't have to look at it. Mark moving money between accounts without mentioning it until after. Mark sitting in on calls I could have handled on my own, then answering for me when I hesitated. Each time it felt like a convenience. Something that made life smoother. Something I didn't need to question. I stood up from the bed and walked over to the window. A car pulled into the lot. An older couple stepped out, moving slowly like they had all the time in the world. They spoke quietly to each other the way people do when they've been together long enough not to need many words. I wondered what that kind of certainty felt like. Not the kind Mark had offered. The real kind. He's just better at this than I am, I had told my friend Elaine once over coffee. Elaine had looked at me for a long moment. Better at what she asked. Handling things I said, money, decisions, all of it. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly like she was filing something away. I didn't ask what. Back in the room, I picked up my phone again. Still no new messages. I didn't know if that made it better or worse. About 3 years ago, things shifted more noticeably. That was when Mark started talking about consolidating everything. We've got too many separate accounts, he said. It's inefficient. We're paying more in fees than we need to. It made sense on the surface. We met with a financial advisor, someone Mark knew from a previous project. The meeting went quickly. Too quickly now that I think about it. Most of the conversation happened between the two of them. I signed where they told me to sign. I asked a few questions, but they were answered in ways that didn't invite more. It's standard, Mark would say. It's just paperwork. I told myself I understood enough. I didn't. A week after that meeting, I noticed I couldn't access one of our accounts online. Temporary issue, Mark said. They're updating the system. I accepted that. A month later, I realized I didn't know exactly how much we had saved. Not because it was hidden, but because I hadn't looked. Because I had trusted him to handle it. Trust is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself when it starts to slip. It just becomes something you assume is still there. Until it isn't. I sat back down on the bed and looked around the room. There was nothing in it that belonged to me beyond what I had brought in my bag. A few clothes, a toothbrush, my wallet, my phone. 12 years of marriage, and that was what I had immediate access to. It wasn't anger that rose up in me. Not yet. It was something else. A kind of clarity. Mark hadn't thrown me out in a moment of anger. That message wasn't written in a rush. It was clean, final, controlled. Which meant he had been thinking about it. Planning it. Just like my grandfather had planned something of his own. The difference was my grandfather had planned to protect me. Mark had planned to remove me. I stood up again and walked over to the small desk. There was a notepad and a pen. I sat down and wrote one sentence. What do I actually control? I stared at it for a moment. Then I started listing things. My job. My name. The documents Mr. Halpern had shown me. The choices I hadn't been making. I stopped writing. For the first time all day I felt something steady underneath everything else. Not confidence. Not yet. But direction. There was a knock on the door. Not loud, just enough to be heard. I opened it. Mr. Halpern stood there still holding that same leather folder. I thought you might want to go over a few more details, he said. I stepped aside and let him in. Yes, I said. I think I do. Mr. Halpern didn't sit right away. He closed the door behind him, took a slow look around the room, and then placed the leather folder on the desk as if he were setting something down that needed respect. You've had some time to think, he said. I nodded, enough to know I don't want to guess anymore. That's a good place to start. He pulled the chair out and sat across from me. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he opened the folder again, turning it so the pages faced me. These are copies, he said. The originals are secured, but everything here is binding. I leaned forward. The paper looked ordinary. That was the unsettling part. Something that could change everything printed in a standard font on standard stock. Let's take it one step at a time, he said. He pointed to a section near the front. This is the trust instrument, he said. It names you as the sole beneficiary. I read the line twice just to be sure I wasn't missing anything. No co-beneficiaries, no shared control, just my name. It also names a trustee, he added. A neutral party, not me, not your husband. Who, I asked. A regional fiduciary firm, he said. They're required to act in your best interest and they answer to the terms your grandfather set, not to anyone else. I nodded slowly, so even if Mark tried to interfere? He couldn't, Mr. Halpern said, not legally. He turned another page. This section outlines the assets, he said. I skimmed the headings. Properties, holdings, accounts. The numbers were there, but I didn't focus on them yet. I focused on the structure. Your grandfather kept most of this outside of anything that could be considered marital property, he explained. Separate entities, separate titles, separate control. So it was never part of what Mark and I built together, I said. That's correct. A quiet, steady relief moved through me. Not excitement, not even gratitude yet. Just space. He tapped a tab further back. This is the clause we discussed, he said, the contingency. I read the title again. Contingency of loss of control. It didn't feel abstract anymore. Go ahead, he said, read it out loud. I hesitated, then did. In the event that the beneficiary is deprived of access to her primary residence financial resources or legal agency due to the actions of a spouse or partner. My voice slowed. The trustee shall grant immediate and full operational control of the trust to the beneficiary without restriction. I looked up. That's very clear. It was meant to be, he said. I read it again more carefully. Without restriction. No waiting period, I asked. Number. No additional approvals. Number. And this applies now. He met my eyes. Yes. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For years, decisions had come with layers, conversations, explanations, permission. Now, for the first time, something was simply mine. No negotiation. No discussion. There's one more thing, Mr. Halpern said. He reached into the folder and pulled out a separate document. This is a record of all transfers and authorizations connected to your joint accounts over the past 3 years. I felt my stomach tighten. Why would I need that? Because he said calmly it shows a pattern. He slid it toward me. I looked down. Dates, amounts, notes. At first it was just numbers. Then I started to see it. Large withdrawals I didn't remember discussing. Transfers between accounts I didn't know existed. Payments to entities I didn't recognize. Is this all from our accounts? I asked. Yes. All authorized by Mark. Yes. And I didn't sign any of these? He shook his head. Number. I felt something shift again. Not confusion this time. Recognition. There are also documents here, he said, pulling another set of papers forward that show attempted changes. I looked at him. What kind of changes? Attempts to add additional authorized signatories. Attempts to restructure ownership on certain assets. I leaned forward. Were any of them successful? No, he said. They required your signature. I stared at the page. I don't remember seeing any of this. You wouldn't, he said. They were never completed. I sat back slowly. So he tried, I said. Yes. And when he couldn't? I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to. Your things are in the trash. Go live with your mother. He needed you out of the way, Mr. Halpern said quietly. Or at least he believed he did. I nodded once. That made more sense than anything else had. I closed the document and rested my hands on it. For a long time I had told myself that whatever was happening in my marriage was manageable, that it was temporary, that if I just stayed steady, things would settle. But this wasn't something that had happened overnight. It had been building. Quietly. Carefully. Just like everything my grandfather had done. Only in the opposite direction. What are my options? I asked. Mr. Halpern didn't rush. You have several, he said. But the first decision is simple. He leaned forward slightly. Do you want to go back to that house tonight? I thought about it. About the kitchen. The living room. The bedroom that no longer felt like it belonged to me. No, I said. The answer came easier than I expected. Then we proceed accordingly, he said. How? I asked. First, we notify the trustee that the contingency has been triggered, he said. That will begin the formal transfer of operational control to you. And how long does that take? Hours, he said, not days. I nodded. What else? We secure your immediate needs, he continued. Housing, access to funds, documentation. I have some savings, I said. He gave a small, knowing look. You have more than that now, he said, but we'll do this properly. He made a few notes, then looked back up. Second, he said, we document everything that has happened today. The message, I asked. Yes, and any other communication. I picked up my phone and handed it to him. He took a photo of the screen, then handed it back. That's enough, I asked. For now, he said. We're not building a case yet. We're establishing a record. A record? It sounded formal. Controlled. The opposite of how the day had started. And Mark, I asked. What about him? I hesitated. I don't know what he expects me to do. Mr. Halpern considered that. He expects you to react, he said. To come back, to argue, to negotiate. I nodded slowly. That sounds right. He closed the folder. You don't have to do any of that, he said. I sat with that for a moment. All day I had been moving from one reaction to the next. Shock, confusion, understanding. Now for the first time there was a pause. A space where I didn't have to respond immediately. What if I don't go back at all, I asked. Then you don't, he said simply. The answer was so straightforward it almost felt unfamiliar. I stood up and walked back to the window. The parking lot lights had come on. The sky was darker now, the trees outside just shapes against it. This morning I had left home thinking I was returning to the same life. Now that life felt distant. Not gone. But no longer something I needed to step back into. I think I said slowly, I need to see him. Mr. Halpern didn't react immediately. Not to argue, I added, just to understand what he thinks he's done. He nodded once. That's your decision, he said, but you don't go alone. I turned back to him. I won't, I said. And for the first time I meant it in a way I hadn't before. I didn't go back that night. Mr. Halpern arranged for me to stay another day at the inn, and by morning things had already begun to shift. Not in a dramatic way, Nothing loud or sudden, just quiet confirmations. A call from the fiduciary firm. A secure email with access instructions. A temporary account set up in my name. It all felt procedural, steady, real. By noon, I could see the structure of something I hadn't had in years: clear ownership, clear access, clear decisions. Mine. I'd like to go back today, I told Mr. Halpern when he called to check in. There was a brief pause on the other end. To the house, he asked. Yes. Are you certain? I am. Another pause, not hesitation, just consideration. Then I'll meet you there, he said. Give me an hour. The drive felt shorter than it had the day before. Same road, same landmarks. But I wasn't looking at them the same way. I wasn't trying to hold on to anything. I was just moving forward. The house came into view as I turned onto our street. It looked exactly the same. White siding. The porch Mark had insisted on repainting last spring. The front yard we never quite finished landscaping. If you didn't know what had happened, nothing about it would seem different. But as I pulled into the driveway, I saw them. 2 black trash bags near the curb. One of them had split open slightly. A sweater I recognized mine hung halfway out, caught on the edge. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. No anger. No shock. Just confirmation. Mr. Halpern's car pulled in behind me a minute later. He stepped out, closing the door with that same careful motion he always used. You don't have to do this today, he said as he walked up beside me. I know, I replied, but I'm going to. He nodded once. Then I'm right here. I got out of the car. The air felt cooler than it had the day before. Or maybe I just noticed it more. I walked past the trash bags without stopping and went up the front steps. The door was locked. Of course it was. I knocked. Not hard, just enough. Footsteps inside. Then the door opened. Mark stood there looking exactly like he always did. Pressed shirt, clean lines, no sign of the decision he had made the day before. For a second he didn't speak. Then his eyes shifted slightly, taking in Mr. Halpern behind me. What is this, he asked. His tone wasn't angry. Just annoyed. I came to get my things, I said. He glanced past me again. You brought a lawyer. He's not my lawyer, I said. He's here to witness. Mark gave a small dismissive breath. That's unnecessary. Maybe I said, but he's staying. There was a moment where he considered pushing back. Then he stepped aside. Fine, he said, make it quick. I walked inside. The house smelled the same. Coffee, wood polish, something faintly citrus from the cleaner we used on the counters. Everything was in place. Except what wasn't. Your things are out front, Mark said from behind me. I saw that, I replied. Then I don't understand why you're here. I turned to face him. Because not everything I own fits in a trash bag. He didn't answer that. I moved through the house slowly. Not searching. Not rushing. Just looking. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway. 12 years of routine laid out exactly the way it had always been. But it didn't feel like mine anymore. In the bedroom, the closet door was open. Half of it empty. The rest his side untouched. Neat, organized. Intact. I walked to the dresser and opened the top drawer. Jewelry, documents, a few personal things I hadn't seen in months. I picked up a small box my grandfather had given me years ago. Inside was a watch. Simple, durable, not expensive. Time matters, he had said when he gave it to me, not in the way people think. I slipped it into my bag. Mark leaned against the doorframe. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be, he said. I didn't look up. I don't think I am. He crossed his arms. Look, this isn't working, he said. It hasn't been for a while. I know, I said. That seemed to catch him off guard. I've been carrying everything, he continued. The finances, the decisions. You've been controlling everything, I said, still calm. He let out a short laugh. Same thing. I closed the drawer and stood up. No, I said, it's not. We stood there for a moment. No raised voices. No sudden movement. Just 2 people looking at something that had already ended. You should have talked to me, he said finally. I tried, I replied. You answered for both of us. That landed. Not hard. Just enough. He shifted his weight. So what now, he asked. I met his eyes. Now, I said, we figure out what this looks like without pretending it's still something it's not. He frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means I'm not moving back in, I said, and I'm not negotiating from the position you think I am. His expression changed then. Not completely, but enough. What position is that, he asked. I reached into my bag and pulled out a copy of the trust summary Mr. Halpern had given me that morning. I held it out. You should read this, I said. He didn't take it right away. What is it? Information, I said. After a moment, he took the paper. His eyes moved across the page. Slowly at first. Then faster. I watched the shift happen. Subtle, but real. What is this? He asked again, quieter this time. My grandfather's estate, I said, and my role in it. He looked back at the paper, then at me. You're serious? Yes. He read a few more lines. His jaw tightened slightly. This doesn't change anything, he said, though there was less certainty in his voice now. It changes a few things, I replied. Like what? I held his gaze. Like the fact that I'm not the one who just lost everything. The room went still. He looked down at the paper again, then back at me. For the first time since I'd walked in, he didn't have an immediate response. I didn't press. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. I just turned, picked up my bag, and walked past him. At the front door, I paused long enough to say one thing. I'll be in touch, I said. Not as a threat. Not as a promise. Just as a statement. Then I stepped outside. The trash bags were still there. I picked up the one with the sweater and set it in the back of my car. Not because I needed it, but because it was mine. Mr. Halpern stood by his car watching quietly. You okay? He asked. I looked back at the house one last time. Then I nodded. Yes, I said. I think I am. I didn't hear from Mark that night. Not a call, not a message, nothing. If this had happened a year earlier, the silence would have unsettled me. I would have wondered what he was thinking, what he was planning, whether I had said something wrong or pushed too far. But that night the silence felt different. It wasn't something I needed to fill. The next morning I sat at the small desk in the inn room with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched yet. The documents were spread out in front of me. Not all of them, just enough to understand the structure. Names of entities I didn't recognize, properties listed by parcel number, investment accounts managed through firms I had never heard of. And my name? Attached to all of it. Not beside someone else's. Not underneath. Mine. There was a knock on the door just after 9. Mr. Halpern stepped in, as steady as always, carrying a thinner folder this time. Morning, he said. Morning. He glanced at the papers on the desk. Getting familiar. Trying to, I said. He set the folder down. That's enough for now, he said. You don't need to understand everything at once. I nodded. What's in that one? Next steps, he said. We sat across from each other again. Different room, same quiet. Have you heard from him? He asked. Number. He didn't seem surprised. That won't last, he said. I know. He opened the folder. There are 2 paths in front of you, he said. Neither of them requires urgency. I listened. First, he continued, you can move forward with separation, formal, documented, clean. And the second, you can wait, he said. See how he responds. Let him define his position more clearly. I considered that. What would you recommend? I asked. He paused. I don't make recommendations in matters like this, he said. I explain consequences, then explain them. If you move forward now, he said, you establish control immediately. You define the terms. You protect what is yours before anything else can be attempted. And if I wait? You give him time, he said. Time to adjust, to react, to possibly try to regain leverage. I nodded slowly. So waiting benefits him. In most cases, he said yes. I leaned back in the chair. For years, I had been the one waiting. Waiting for Mark to explain things. Waiting for the right time to bring something up. Waiting for things to settle. I didn't feel like waiting anymore. I want to move forward, I said. Mr. Halpern gave a small nod. Then we'll begin the process today. He slid a document toward me. Initial notice, he said. This formally records the change in your circumstances and your intent to separate financial and legal interests. I read through it carefully. No rush. No pressure. Just information. For once I understood what I was signing. Do I need to contact him? I asked. Not directly, he said. He will be notified. I nodded. That felt right. I signed the document. The pen moved steadily across the page. No hesitation. No second guessing. "There's something else you should be aware of," Mr. Halpern said, closing the folder. I looked up. "What?" "Your grandfather left a letter," he said. "Not part of the legal documents, personal." I felt something shift again. "When?" "It's dated the same week he revised the trust," he said. "He asked that you receive it only if the contingency was triggered." I sat still for a moment. "Do you have it?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single envelope. Cream-colored, my name written on the front in that same steady handwriting. I took it carefully. It felt lighter than I expected, but heavier somehow too. "You can read it now," he said, "or later." I nodded. "Later," I said. He didn't push. After he left, I sat there with the envelope in my hands. For a long time, I didn't open it. I just looked at my name, the way he had written it. Clear, certain. When I finally did open it, the paper inside was folded neatly. I unfolded it slowly. If you're reading this, it means something I hoped wouldn't happen has happened. It means you've been put in a position where you feel like you've lost control. I'm sorry for that. I paused. Not because I didn't want to keep reading, but because he had been right. You won't like how I handled this. I know that. I didn't tell you everything. I didn't warn you the way you might think I should have. But I also know you, and I know that some things have to be seen, not explained. I let out a slow breath. You are not someone who needs to be saved. You are someone who needs to remember that you can stand on your own. If you're reading this, then you're already there. You just don't know it yet. My hands were steady now. Don't use what I've left you to prove anything to anyone. Not to him, not to anyone else. Use it to build something that belongs to you. I looked out the window. The same parking lot, the same trees. But they didn't feel like the whole picture anymore. And if you can in time, don't carry anger longer than it serves you. It weighs more than anything I could ever leave behind. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I set it on the desk in front of me. For years I had thought strength looked a certain way. Loud, certain, unyielding. But sitting there in that quiet room, I understood something different. Strength could be quiet. It could be patient. It could wait until the moment it was needed and then simply exist. Mark didn't understand that. He thought control came from holding everything tightly. From managing, directing, deciding. He didn't see that what he had been holding wasn't strength. It was dependence. And the moment I stepped out of it, there was nothing left for him to hold on to. I picked up my phone. Still no messages. Still no calls. That was fine. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen. Something already had. The papers moved forward without much noise. That was the part that surprised me the most. No shouting, no scenes, no long drawn-out arguments like the ones you see on television, just documents, notices, signatures, and a series of decisions that didn't require anyone to raise their voice. Within a week, I had a place to stay that wasn't temporary. It wasn't large, not impressive. A small house on the edge of town, close enough to the grocery store and the pharmacy, far enough that evenings stayed quiet. The kind of place you could grow into without needing to explain why you chose it. It was mine. Not because of the size or the price, because I chose it. I kept my job. That was another decision people didn't expect. You don't have to, Elaine told me when we met for coffee again. I know, I said. Then why would you? I thought about that for a moment before answering. Because I want to, I said. She studied me for a second, then smiled. All right, she said, that makes sense. The trust settled into the background of my life. It didn't disappear. It just stopped being the center of everything. There were meetings, conversations, decisions I had to make about things I hadn't managed before. At first it felt like learning a new language. But I took my grandfather's advice even if he had never said it directly in this context. Take your time. Do it right once. I didn't rush into anything. I didn't try to prove anything either. Not to Mark. Not to the people who suddenly looked at me differently when they realized what had changed. I paid attention. I asked questions, and when I didn't understand something, I said so. That alone felt like a shift. Mark reached out after the second week. A short message. We need to talk. I looked at it for a while before responding. We will, through the attorneys. No anger. No explanation. Just a boundary. The process of separating everything took time. Not because it was complicated, because it had to be done carefully. There were accounts to close, assets to divide, legal lines to draw where there had once been shared space. Mark didn't fight as much as I expected. At least not directly. There were attempts. Questions framed in a way that suggested confusion rather than intent. Are you sure this is necessary? Can't we handle this privately? But each time the answer stayed the same. This is how it will be handled. We saw each other once in person a month later. Not at the house. At a small office downtown with 2 attorneys present and a table that felt too wide for conversation. He looked the same. But something in the way he held himself had changed. Less certain. Less controlled. I didn't think you'd go this far, he said at one point. His voice wasn't sharp. Just quieter than I remembered. I didn't think I had to, I replied. He nodded like that made sense, or like he didn't have a better answer. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he said after a moment. I believed that. Not because it excused anything. Because it explained it. You were trying to protect yourself, I said. He didn't argue. There wasn't much else to say after that. Not because there weren't things left unsaid. Because they didn't need to be said anymore. The final papers were signed 2 months after everything started. No ceremony. No sense of victory. Just a quiet conclusion to something that had already ended long before. Life didn't become perfect after that. That's not how it works. There were still decisions to make, still moments where I wasn't sure I was doing the right thing. Still days where I missed the version of my life I thought I had. But those moments didn't last the way they used to. They passed. And I stayed. I started visiting my mother more often. Not because I had nowhere else to go. Because I wanted to. We sat at her kitchen table drinking coffee that was always a little too strong, talking about things we hadn't made time for in years. Small things. Real things. I also went back to the feed store. The same one I had pulled over near that day. It was still there. Same sign, same worn floors, same slow rhythm. I didn't need anything. I just walked through it. Looked at the shelves. Let myself remember. On the way out, I caught my reflection in the glass door. For a second, I didn't recognize what had changed. Then I did. It wasn't how I looked. It was how I stood. My grandfather had never tried to make me into something else. He had just made sure that when the time came, I would have the space to become who I already was. I kept his letter in the drawer by my bed. Not because I needed to read it often. Because I knew it was there. Sometimes in the evenings I would sit on the small porch of my new house and watch the light fade. No rush. No noise. Just time moving the way it's supposed to. I used to think that losing everything would feel like the end. Like something you couldn't come back from. But I learned something different. Sometimes losing what was never truly yours is the only way to see what is. If you've ever found yourself in a place where everything feels like it's been taken from you, where the life you built doesn't look the way you thought it would, take a moment. Not to react. Not to fix it all at once. Just to see it clearly. Because sometimes the moment you think you've lost control is the moment you're finally being given it back. And if this story meant something to you, if it felt familiar in ways you didn't expect, I hope you'll take that quiet understanding and carry it with you. Maybe share it with someone who needs it. Maybe stay a little longer, listen to another story. Either way, I'm glad you were here. The slap echoed louder than the music. For one strange second, nobody in that ballroom moved. Not the caterers carrying silver trays. Not the string quartet near the windows. Not the 200 guests sitting beneath crystal chandeliers overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. Not even me. I just stood there in my white wedding gown with my head turned sideways from the force of Daniel's hand. My future husband had slapped me in front of everyone. And his mother smiled. I still remember the smell of cigarette smoke floating through the ballroom when it happened. Sharp, bitter, thick enough to sting my lungs. I had only asked politely, "Mrs. Whitmore, would you mind smoking outside? My lungs have been sensitive lately." That was it. I said it softly, respectfully. But Daniel suddenly exploded like a man waiting his entire life for an excuse. "Shut up," he shouted. The entire room froze. "You smell worse than cigarettes." Then came the slap. I heard several women gasp. Someone dropped a champagne glass near the dance floor. My cheek burned instantly, but honestly the pain wasn't what shocked me. It was the humiliation. At 42 years old, after 21 years in the United States Navy, after surviving deployments, toxic smoke exposure overseas, and the deaths of men I respected deeply, I had never felt smaller than I did standing there in my wedding dress. And the worst part, a piece of me wasn't even surprised. Because deep down I think I had spent the last 3 years pretending not to see who Daniel really was. 5 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened. And everything changed. But before I tell you about that moment, you need to understand how I ended up standing at that altar in the first place. My name is Rebecca Lawson. Commander Rebecca Lawson, technically. Though most people simply call me Becca. I grew up outside Norfolk, Virginia, in a modest blue-collar family. My father repaired electrical systems at the shipyard, and my mother worked the front desk at a dentist's office for nearly 30 years. We weren't poor, but we counted every dollar. My father believed in 3 things: show up early, work hard, and never complain. The Navy became my path out of a small life. I enlisted at 19. By 25, I was an officer. By 40, I had spent more birthdays overseas than at home. The Navy gave me structure, purpose, and honestly, family. But military life can also leave people lonely in ways civilians don't always understand. Especially women. Especially older women. You spend decades moving from base to base while other people build homes, raise children, host backyard cookouts, and celebrate anniversaries. Meanwhile, you become very good at saying goodbye. I met Daniel Whitmore at a charity fundraiser in Annapolis 4 years before the wedding. He was handsome in that polished East Coast way. Expensive watch, confident smile, tailored Navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. He owned a financial consulting company with his cousin. At first, he made me feel admired. After years around military culture where emotions stayed tightly controlled, Daniel felt warm and charming. He brought flowers, opened doors, held my hand in public, and after enough lonely years, that kind of attention can feel dangerous. Looking back now, the warning signs appeared early, very early. The first time Daniel met my Navy friends, he joked, "So which one of you actually does the fighting?" Everybody laughed politely except me. Then there were little comments. "You'd look prettier if you wore your hair longer. Do you really need to work this much at your age?" A man wants peace when he comes home, not another commanding officer. Most of those comments came from his mother, Linda Whitmore. Linda belonged to one of those wealthy Maryland families that quietly measured human worth through money, appearances, and social status. She smiled often, but never kindly. The first time I visited their waterfront home, she looked at my uniform photo and said, "Oh my, Rebecca, you've certainly lived an unconventional life." Unconventional. That word stayed with me. Linda believed military women were masculine, aggressive, and unsuitable for marriage. She never said it directly. Women like Linda never do. Instead, they poison slowly. Tiny comments over dinner, passive little insults hidden inside compliments. "You're very impressive for someone with such a stressful career." Daniel has always needed softness in a woman. "I just worry military life makes people emotionally hard." Daniel never defended me, not once. And somehow I kept excusing it. Because loneliness can make intelligent people tolerate things they normally wouldn't. Especially after 40. Especially after years of watching everybody else build families while you unpack another suitcase alone in another temporary apartment. By the time we became engaged, I already knew something felt wrong. But I convinced myself marriage required compromise, patience, understanding. I told myself Linda would eventually warm up to me. I told myself Daniel's temper came from stress. I told myself many lies. The wedding took place in early October at a historic waterfront hotel in Annapolis. Beautiful weather, cool breeze off the water, golden leaves drifting near the marina. Nearly 200 guests attended, including several Navy officers I had served beside for years. Most of them sat quietly toward the back, because Daniel never liked attention focused on my military career. He once told me, "Tonight is about us, not the Navy." Still, a few came because they loved me. One of them was Admiral Thomas Avery, a respected 2-star admiral nearing retirement. He had mentored me for nearly 15 years. Truthfully, he was more protective of me than Daniel ever was. The reception started smoothly enough. Dinner, champagne, soft jazz music. Then Linda lit a cigarette near the bridal table, inside the ballroom. I noticed immediately because cigarette smoke still affects my breathing after toxic exposure during a deployment years ago near the Persian Gulf. Most people around me knew that. Linda definitely knew. She exhaled smoke slowly while watching me, almost like a test. I tried ignoring it at first, but after several minutes my chest tightened, so I leaned forward gently and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, would you mind smoking outside? My lungs have been sensitive lately." I smiled when I said it. I truly did. Then Daniel stood up so violently his chair nearly fell backward. "Shut up," he barked. The room went silent. "You smell worse than cigarettes?" And then, the slap. I remember the taste of blood inside my mouth. I remember Linda smiling into her wine glass. I remember hearing one elderly woman whisper, "Oh my God." And then, 5 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened. 12 Navy officers walked inside wearing full dress uniforms. And behind them, Admiral Avery stepped into the room. Daniel's face turned white. The ballroom became so quiet I could hear the water outside hitting the docks below the hotel. 12 Navy officers stood near the entrance in formal dress whites, their medals catching the chandelier light. And behind them stood Admiral Thomas Avery, 6'3", silver-haired, straight posture that somehow made the entire room sit taller the second he entered. I saw several guests immediately recognize the stars on his shoulders. People who had been whispering moments earlier suddenly fell silent. Daniel's face drained of color beside me, because for the first time that evening he realized something important. He had absolutely no idea who I really was. Admiral Avery walked directly toward me without looking at anyone else. Not Daniel, not Linda, not the guests, only me. Every Navy officer in the room stood immediately. A few civilians copied them awkwardly after realizing something serious was happening. The Admiral stopped inches from me and looked carefully at the red mark forming across my cheek. His jaw tightened. "Commander Lawson," he said quietly, "are you all right?" Commander Lawson, not Rebecca, not Becca. My rank, my identity, the one thing I had spent years shrinking to protect Daniel's fragile ego. I swallowed hard before answering. "Yes, sir," but my voice shook slightly. The Admiral noticed. He always noticed. Daniel suddenly forced an uncomfortable laugh. "Admiral Avery, right?" he said, stepping forward too quickly. "I'm Daniel, Rebecca's fiancé." Was. Not fiancé. Not anymore. Though I don't think any of us understood that fully yet. The Admiral turned slowly toward him. His expression stayed calm but cold. Very cold. "I'm aware of who you are," he replied. Then his eyes moved briefly toward my cheek again. That silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like 3 hours. Behind the Admiral, I noticed Commander Elise Monroe standing near the entrance. We had served together overseas years earlier. Beside her stood Captain Raymond Brooks, one of the sharpest logistics officers I'd ever known. These weren't random guests. These were respected officers. People who had spent decades serving this country, and every one of them had just witnessed Daniel slap me. Linda finally spoke, her voice syrupy and fake. "Oh dear, I'm sure this is all just wedding stress." Nobody answered her, not even Daniel. The Admiral looked back at me. "Would you like to step outside for some air, Commander?" The truth is, at that moment I wanted to disappear. Not because of the slap, but because I suddenly saw my entire life from the outside. A 42-year-old Navy commander standing in a ballroom beside a man who had publicly humiliated her. And somehow I had almost married him. I nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." As we started walking, Daniel grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but possessively. "Rebecca," he hissed quietly, "don't make this dramatic." Something inside me shifted when he said that. Because my humiliation wasn't the problem to him. His embarrassment was. I gently pulled my hand away. And for the first time in years, I stopped trying to soothe him. The hotel balcony overlooked the harbor. Boats rocked quietly in the dark water below while cold October wind swept across the marina. Admiral Avery stood beside me near the railing. For a while neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, "I should have said something sooner." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He folded his hands behind his back. "The way that man talks to you." I stared out at the water. "He's not always like that." The Admiral gave me a look older people recognize immediately. The look that says, "Please don't lie to yourself in front of me." "Rebecca," he said gently, "I've known you 15 years, and that was true." Thomas Avery had watched me grow from a nervous young lieutenant into a commander trusted during international evacuation operations. He knew me better than most people ever had. He knew about the deployment that damaged my lungs. Kuwait. Oil fire smoke and chemical exposure after an attack near one of our temporary operational sites. I spent weeks coughing blood afterward. The Navy covered my treatments quietly, but the damage never fully disappeared. Certain smoke still triggered breathing problems, like cigarette smoke. Linda knew that. Daniel knew that too. Neither cared. "You know what bothers me most," I finally whispered. The Admiral waited. I wasn't shocked when he hit me. Saying the words out loud made my stomach twist. Not shocked. Because somewhere deep inside, I think I had spent years preparing emotionally for the day Daniel's temper crossed that line. It hadn't started physically. Men like Daniel rarely begin there. First comes the disrespect, the sarcasm, the small humiliations disguised as jokes. Then isolation. then emotional control. Then one day the line disappears. I closed my eyes briefly. There were signs, I admitted. The Admiral nodded once. Yes. And strangely, hearing somebody confirm it brought relief instead of shame. Because older women especially are taught to explain away bad behavior. He's stressed. He didn't mean it. He had a rough childhood. You know how men are. But deep down, most women know. I certainly did. I remembered the first deployment Daniel mocked. I had just returned from coordinating civilian evacuations during a dangerous operation overseas. 3 straight days with almost no sleep. I was exhausted, emotionally drained. When I told him how difficult it had been watching terrified families board transport aircraft, he rolled his eyes and said, "You military people always act like you're saving the world." Another time he complained because I missed one of his business dinners during an emergency briefing at the Pentagon. "You care more about strangers than your own relationship," he snapped. At the time I apologized. God help me. I apologized. The Admiral leaned slightly against the railing beside me. "You know why your officers respect you?" he asked. I shook my head faintly. "Because you protect people under pressure." His voice stayed calm. "You walk into chaos and make others feel safe." I looked down at my wedding ring. Suddenly it felt heavy, embarrassing, like a symbol of every compromise I made against my own instincts. Inside the ballroom, music had completely stopped now. Guests were murmuring nervously. I could see silhouettes moving near the windows, watching. The Admiral turned toward me fully. "Commander," he asked carefully, "do you want us to stay?" Not forcefully, not controlling. Just support. Real support. And for the first time all evening, I realized I didn't want Daniel comforting me. I didn't even want him near me. Slowly, I slid the wedding ring off my finger. My hands trembled slightly from adrenaline. Then I looked back toward the ballroom doors, toward the man who slapped me in front of 200 people. And I finally understood something that took me 42 years to learn. Loneliness had made me tolerate things self-respect never should have allowed. I closed my hand around the ring. Then I answered softly, "Yes, sir." The moment I walked back into that ballroom without my wedding ring on, people knew. Nobody needed an announcement. Nobody needed explanations. At my age, you learn people can sense when something permanent has broken. The string quartet had stopped playing completely. Champagne glasses sat untouched on tables. Even the hotel staff looked nervous. Daniel stood near the center of the dance floor, trying desperately to appear calm, while sweat gathered along his forehead. His mother stood beside him, clutching her cigarette with stiff fingers, though she had finally stopped smoking after several guests glared at her. The second Daniel saw me returning with Admiral Avery and the other officers behind me, his expression shifted. The anger disappeared. Now came charm, manipulation, damage control. "Baby," he said quickly, forcing a laugh, "come on, don't embarrass me like this." Embarrass him. That phrase settled into my chest heavier than the slap itself. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not even I lost control. Just fear about himself. His image. His reputation. I looked around the ballroom slowly. 200 people watching. Some uncomfortable. Some angry. Some pretending not to stare. And suddenly I felt strangely calm. For years I had feared public humiliation. Feared becoming the older woman people whispered about. Feared failed relationships. Feared ending up alone. But standing there in front of everybody, something unexpected happened. I stopped being afraid. Linda stepped forward with a brittle smile. "Rebecca," she said sweetly, "you're upset right now. Let's not ruin the evening over one little misunderstanding." One little misunderstanding. That woman could have watched a house burn down and still called it an unfortunate inconvenience. I looked directly at her for the first time without trying to earn her approval. "You smiled when he hit me," I said quietly. Her expression twitched. Only slightly. But enough. Daniel immediately interrupted. "Oh my God, Rebecca, stop making this dramatic." That word again. Dramatic. Funny how people always call women dramatic when women finally stop accepting disrespect. I took a slow breath. Then I heard my own voice say something I never imagined saying at my wedding. "The wedding is over." Complete silence. Somebody near the back gasped softly. Daniel blinked at me like he genuinely thought he'd misunderstood. "What?" "The wedding," I repeated calmly, "is over." Linda laughed once in disbelief. "Oh, don't be ridiculous." But I wasn't speaking emotionally anymore. That frightened them more than tears would have. I reached down and placed my wedding ring gently on the bridal table beside the flower centerpiece. No throwing, no screaming, no scene. Just finality. Daniel's face darkened instantly. "You're seriously doing this," he hissed. I met his eyes steadily. "You slapped me in front of 200 people. You provoked me." There it was. The sentence almost every abusive man eventually says. "You provoked me." Several guests visibly reacted to that, especially the older women. I noticed one elderly woman at table 7 slowly shaking her head with visible disgust. Her husband leaned toward Daniel and said quietly but firmly, "Son, a real man never hits a woman." Daniel ignored him completely, because men like Daniel never listen once their ego takes over. They only escalate. "You think you're perfect?" he snapped at me now. "You think everybody here doesn't know how cold you are?" I stayed silent. He stepped closer. "You care more about your Navy career than relationships? Everybody knows it." I almost answered defensively out of habit. Years of habit. Years of explaining myself. But then something inside me simply stopped. Because suddenly I understood no explanation would ever be enough for someone determined to diminish me. The Admiral stepped slightly forward beside me. Not aggressively. Just enough. Daniel noticed immediately. And for the first time all evening I saw fear flicker across his face. Not guilt. Fear. Because now the room no longer saw him as the successful, charming businessman. Now they saw what he truly was, a man who struck his bride in public. And people over 60 especially understand something younger generations sometimes forget. Character eventually reveals itself under pressure. Always. Daniel lowered his voice. "Rebecca," he muttered, "please don't destroy everything over one mistake." Destroy everything. Again, not concern for me. Concern for himself. His lifestyle. His image. His future. And suddenly I saw our entire relationship clearly. The luxury dinners, the country club parties, the polished photos online, the expensive vacations. Underneath all of it sat one simple truth. Daniel needed admiration more than love. And I had spent years trying to become smaller so he could feel bigger. I looked around the ballroom one last time. The cake, the flowers, the orchestra. Thousands of dollars spent on a wedding that suddenly felt like theater. Then my eyes landed on Commander Elise Monroe near the entrance. She gave me the smallest nod. Not pity. Respect. That nearly broke me emotionally. Because I realized I had received more genuine support from fellow officers than from the man I was about to marry. Daniel reached toward me again. This time I stepped back before he touched me. The movement shocked him. Because I had spent years accommodating him automatically. Apologizing automatically. Softening automatically. Not anymore. "I'm leaving," I said calmly. Linda scoffed loudly. "Oh, please. Where exactly are you going to go at your age?" That sentence hit hard. Not because it was true. Because it revealed exactly how she viewed women. As people who should tolerate misery rather than face solitude. I looked at her steadily. "At my age," I said quietly, "peace matters more than appearances." For the first time all evening, Linda had no response. I bent down, slipped off my high heels, and held them in one hand. The marble floor felt cold beneath my feet as I walked toward the ballroom exit. And strangely, every step felt lighter. Behind me I heard Daniel calling my name. Then louder. Then angrily. But I kept walking. The Navy officers walked beside me silently as we moved through the hotel hallway. Nobody rushed me. Nobody pressured me. Outside, cold autumn air hit my face. I inhaled deeply. And for the first time in years, breathing felt easier than it had inside that ballroom. Then suddenly flashing red and blue lights reflected across the hotel windows. 3 police cruisers pulled into the circular driveway. Daniel stepped outside behind us just as 2 officers exited their vehicles. And the look on his face told me something important. For the first time that night, he understood actions had consequences. The police officers entered the hotel lobby with the calm expression people develop after years of handling domestic disturbances. Steady, professional, unemotional. But the moment Daniel saw them approaching, his confidence cracked. "Are you serious right now?" he snapped loudly, looking around the crowd. "Who called the police?" Nobody answered him. One of the officers, a gray-haired sergeant who looked close to retirement age himself, stepped forward calmly. "Sir, we received reports of an assault." Daniel immediately pointed toward me. "She's blowing this out of proportion." Out of proportion. Funny phrase. As if being struck in front of 200 people was a misunderstanding over dinner reservations. The officer looked at me gently. "Ma'am, are you injured?" My cheek still burned. But emotionally I felt strangely detached now, almost exhausted. "I'm all right," I answered quietly. Before Daniel could speak again, a woman near the hotel entrance raised her phone. "I recorded it," she said firmly. Another guest lifted his hand. So did I. Then another voice. I saw the whole thing. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Because public humiliation works both ways. Daniel had slapped me publicly. Now witnesses existed publicly too. Linda suddenly stepped forward wearing that same polished social smile. "Officers, surely we can handle this privately. Emotions are high tonight." The older sergeant looked at her for about 2 seconds before replying, "Ma'am, assault is assault. Simple. Direct. No performance. Daniel ran both hands through his hair aggressively. Oh my God, he muttered, this is insane. But deep down, I think he already understood something important. His usual charm wasn't working anymore. Men like Daniel survive through image management, confidence, control. But once enough people witness the truth simultaneously, the mask collapses fast. One officer quietly asked whether I wanted to file an official complaint. I hesitated, not because I doubted what happened, because older generations, especially women my age, were raised to avoid becoming the reason for public scandal, even after being hurt, even after humiliation. We were trained to preserve peace at our own expense. Admiral Avery spoke quietly beside me. You don't owe anybody silence. That sentence settled deeply into me. You don't owe anybody silence. For years I had confused endurance with strength, but they aren't the same thing. Not even close. I finally nodded. Yes, I said softly, I'd like to make a statement. Daniel stared at me like I had betrayed him. Not because he regretted hurting me, because consequences had arrived. An hour later, most guests had quietly left the hotel. The wedding reception had dissolved into scattered flower petals, abandoned champagne glasses, and exhausted staff members cleaning tables beneath dimmed chandeliers. I sat in a private conference room with a police officer taking my statement while Admiral Avery waited outside. The female officer interviewing me appeared somewhere in her late 50s. Calm eyes. Wedding ring. Gentle voice. When I finished speaking, she closed her notebook slowly and asked, Has he ever put his hands on you before? I stared down at the table. No. Then after a pause, Not exactly. She waited carefully. There were other things, I admitted quietly. I began describing moments I had buried for years. Daniel grabbing my arm too tightly during arguments, blocking doorways, punching walls, mocking my military service, calling me cold, unfeminine, emotionally damaged. The officer listened without interruption. When I finished, she nodded slowly. I've heard stories like this for 30 years, she said gently. It almost always starts long before the first slap. That sentence stayed with me. Because she was right. The slap wasn't the beginning. It was the reveal. Over the next several days, the fallout spread quickly through Annapolis social circles. Somebody leaked one of the wedding videos online. Not the slap itself at first, just the aftermath. Daniel shouting, me standing silently, Navy officers surrounding the situation. Then eventually the actual video surfaced. I never watched it. I couldn't. But others did. Thousands of others. Veterans groups began sharing outrage online after learning Daniel had struck a senior Navy officer during her wedding reception. Several local news stations contacted the hotel asking questions. Daniel's business partners stopped returning his calls. One investor publicly withdrew from an upcoming development project. And suddenly the same wealthy people who once adored Daniel started distancing themselves quietly. That's another thing older people understand well. Many social circles are built entirely on convenience, not loyalty. Convenience. Linda called me 3 days later. I almost ignored it. But curiosity won. The second I answered, she sighed dramatically. Rebecca, she said, haven't we all suffered enough? Not, I'm sorry. Not, how are you holding up? Just concern about discomfort. I closed my eyes briefly. Your son hit me. He was emotional. He assaulted me. Linda's voice hardened immediately. You humiliated him in front of everyone. There it was again. Not concern for morality. Concern for image. I suddenly understood something chilling about that family. They didn't measure right versus wrong. Only embarrassment versus convenience. Before hanging up, Linda said one final thing. You never knew how to let a man feel respected. I almost laughed. Because for years I had sacrificed pieces of myself trying to protect Daniel's ego, and it still wasn't enough. Nothing ever would have been. A week later, I drove to visit Margaret Holloway, retired Navy widow, 78 years old, sharp-minded, blunt. She had mentored countless younger military women over the decades, including me. Margaret lived alone in a quiet cottage outside Norfolk with an old golden retriever named Charlie sleeping near the fireplace. She poured coffee into 2 mugs while I explained everything. Not once did she interrupt. When I finally finished, she leaned back slowly in her chair. Loneliness, she said softly, can make strong women tolerate weak love. I stared at my coffee silently. Because that sentence hit too close to the truth. Margaret studied me carefully. You spent your whole adult life being needed, she continued. That kind of life can make being chosen feel more important than being respected. I felt tears threaten my eyes for the first time since the wedding. Not from humiliation anymore. From recognition. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. Rebecca, she said, peace is not loneliness. That sentence changed something inside me. Because maybe I had confused the two for years. When I left Margaret's cottage that evening, the sky had already turned dark over the water. I sat inside my car for several minutes before starting the engine. Then my phone rang. Daniel. I almost declined the call. But something told me to answer. His voice sounded different immediately. Less arrogant. More desperate. There's something you don't know, he said quietly. I frowned. What are you talking about? A long silence followed. Then he said, It's about your father. I didn't speak for several seconds after Daniel mentioned my father. The line stayed quiet except for faint traffic noise somewhere behind him. What about my father? I finally asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. Can we meet in person? Every instinct told me not to. But another part of me, the same part that had spent years searching for closure in broken places, needed answers. We agreed to meet the next afternoon at a quiet seafood restaurant overlooking the marina in Annapolis. The kind of place older couples visit after church on Sundays. Simple white tablecloths, lemon water, soft Frank Sinatra playing through ceiling speakers. When I arrived, Daniel was already seated in a corner booth. And honestly, he looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, wrinkled shirt, no confidence, no polished businessman charm. Just a tired man watching his life unravel. For a brief moment I almost pitied him. Then I remembered his hand across my face, the humiliation, Linda smiling, and the feeling disappeared. Daniel stood awkwardly when I approached. Thanks for coming. I sat down carefully across from him. What about my father? He rubbed his hands together nervously. I didn't want to tell you this before the wedding. Tell me what? He hesitated. Then finally said, Linda hired a private investigator after we got engaged. I stared at him. My stomach tightened immediately. She became obsessed with your family background, he continued quietly. She thought your father had hidden debts or gambling problems. I felt anger rise slowly through my chest. My father worked 38 years in a shipyard, I said coldly. He died with less than $500 in his checking account. I know. Then why investigate him? Daniel looked down at the table. Because my mother believes poor people are dangerous. The sentence didn't even shock me anymore. It simply confirmed everything I already knew. Daniel swallowed hard. The investigator found medical records from years ago. I frowned slightly. What records? He looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Your father knew your lung damage was getting worse after your deployment. My chest tightened. What are you talking about? Daniel leaned forward carefully. He tried contacting specialists before he died. I stared at him silently, because suddenly memories returned. My father insisting I stop ignoring my coughing. My father asking questions about military hospitals. My father sounding worried during phone calls I barely had time to answer. At the time I thought he was simply being protective. But apparently, it was more than that, Daniel continued quietly. He spent most of his retirement savings trying to find treatment options for you. I looked away toward the harbor windows. My father had died 3 years earlier from a heart attack. We never got to have one final meaningful conversation. Military life stole too many of those chances. I swallowed carefully. Why are you telling me this now? Daniel's answer came too quickly. Because I don't want you thinking I'm a monster. There it was. Not remorse. Self-preservation. Again. I looked back at him steadily. You slapped me in public. His jaw tightened. You humiliated my mother. I almost laughed at the insanity of that sentence. I asked her not to smoke near my damaged lungs. She's old-fashioned. She's cruel. Daniel's eyes hardened slightly. You always hated her. No, I said calmly. I spent years trying to earn approval she never intended to give. That shut him up briefly. The waitress arrived with coffee neither of us touched. Outside sailboats drifted quietly through gray afternoon water. Finally, Daniel leaned back heavily. You know what your problem is, Rebecca? I almost smiled. There it was. The real Daniel returning. My problem. You make people feel small. The sentence lingered between us, and suddenly, I understood him completely. Not just his anger, his resentment, his insecurity, everything. Daniel had never truly loved my strength. He loved being associated with it. The uniform, the status, the discipline, the admiration people showed me. But privately, my accomplishments made him feel inadequate. You know what's ironic? I asked quietly. He frowned. I spent years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. Daniel looked away immediately, because he knew it was true. I continued softly. I apologized for my career, my deployments, my responsibilities, my schedule, my promotions. You were never home, he muttered defensively. I was serving my country. You always chose work first. That sentence used to hurt me deeply. Not anymore. Because older age brings clarity, younger people sometimes lack. People who truly love you don't punish you for your purpose. They honor it. Daniel suddenly leaned forward again. You think another man's going to want this life? He asked bitterly. A woman in her 40s with health problems and military baggage. For years, words like that would have shattered me. Not now, because something inside me had fundamentally changed since the wedding. I no longer feared being alone more than being disrespected. And that changes everything. I stood slowly from the booth. Daniel looked startled. That's it? He asked. I nodded calmly. Yes. You're just walking away. I looked down at him quietly. You already walked away the moment you raised your hand. For once he had no clever response. No manipulation. No charm. Just silence. I left money on the table for my untouched coffee and walked toward the exit. But before I reached the door, Daniel called after me one last time. Rebecca. I turned slightly. And for the first time since I met him, he looked small. Not financially. Not socially. Spiritually. Emotionally. Just small. I did love you, he said quietly. I believed he thought that was true. But love without respect eventually becomes possession. And possession becomes resentment. I gave him a small nod. Then I walked out into the cold harbor air without looking back. Over the following weeks, the consequences continued spreading through Daniel's life. Several investors pulled out of his business ventures completely. The wedding video kept circulating online. Not viral nationwide, but enough. Enough for local damage, enough for whispers at country clubs, enough for people to quietly avoid invitations involving the Whitmore family. 2 former employees even contacted investigators regarding questionable financial practices tied to Daniel's company. Apparently, public exposure has a way of loosening old secrets. Linda reportedly blamed me for all of it. Of course she did. People like Linda never see consequences as the result of behavior, only betrayal. But strangely, none of it brought me satisfaction. Not real satisfaction. Because revenge, I learned, is rarely as healing as freedom. And freedom finally began arriving quietly in my life. Then, one afternoon, nearly a month after the wedding disaster, I received a formal envelope from the Navy. Inside was an invitation. A retirement ceremony. Mine. After 21 years of service, the Navy planned to honor my career publicly in Norfolk. I stared at the invitation for a long time. And honestly, part of me considered not going at all. I almost didn't attend my own retirement ceremony. That probably sounds strange after spending 21 years in the Navy, but the truth is, I was tired. Not physically. Spiritually. The wedding disaster had drained something deep inside me. For weeks afterward, I moved through life quietly. I stayed off social media, ignored gossip, avoided unnecessary phone calls. I spent most mornings sitting on the small balcony of my temporary apartment near Norfolk Harbor, drinking coffee while cargo ships moved slowly through the gray Atlantic fog. And for the first time in decades, silence no longer frightened me. It comforted me. That realization alone changed my life, because for years I had mistaken noise for love, attention for connection, endurance for loyalty. The retirement ceremony was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at Naval Station Norfolk. Simple, traditional, respectful. Exactly the kind of ceremony older military officers appreciate. No unnecessary spectacle, just honor. I almost called to cancel twice that week. Part of me didn't feel worthy anymore after everything that happened. Funny how humiliation works. Even when somebody else hurts you, shame still tries attaching itself to your identity. But on the morning of the ceremony, I received a voicemail from Admiral Avery. Commander Lawson, he said warmly, you showed up for this country for 21 years. Let the Navy show up for you today. So I went. The October air carried that crisp coastal chill Virginia gets near the water. I wore my full-dress white uniform carefully for what would likely be the last official time. Every ribbon, every medal, every insignia polished perfectly. When I looked in the mirror before leaving home, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked weak, because I finally looked honest. No pretending, no shrinking, no apologizing. Just me. The ceremony took place inside a modest naval auditorium overlooking the base. Rows of chairs slowly filled with officers, sailors, retired veterans, civilian staff, and a few close friends. Commander Elise Monroe sat near the front. Margaret Holloway came too, walking slowly with a cane beside her golden retriever service dog. Even seeing her there nearly brought tears to my eyes. And then something unexpected happened. People kept approaching me. Young officers, junior sailors, women especially, one after another. A lieutenant shook my hand and said, "You were the first female commander I ever saw leading overseas operations." A young communications officer quietly admitted, "You made me stay in the Navy when I thought I couldn't handle it anymore." Another woman said, "Thank you for proving women don't have to become smaller to lead." I stood there speechless, Because for weeks I had focused only on what I lost. The marriage, the illusion, the future I thought I wanted. But I forgot something important. My life had mattered long before Daniel Whitmore entered it, and it would continue mattering after him too. The ceremony itself remained beautifully simple. Admiral Avery delivered the official remarks. He spoke about service, sacrifice, leadership under pressure. Then unexpectedly he paused and looked directly toward me. There are officers who perform their duties, he said calmly. And then there are officers who quietly carry other people through difficult seasons of life. The room stayed completely silent. Commander Rebecca Lawson spent 21 years protecting people under pressure without ever asking for recognition. I lowered my eyes briefly, because after everything that happened, being seen kindly again felt overwhelming. The Admiral continued. She represents something increasingly rare in this world, steady character. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Steady character. Not perfection, not toughness, not achievement. Character. The audience stood for applause when the ceremony ended. Long, warm, sincere. And suddenly I realized something beautiful. The slap at my wedding had not destroyed my dignity. It revealed who never deserved access to it. A few months later, my life looked very different. Quieter. Smaller in some ways. Better in others. I bought a modest little waterfront cottage outside Norfolk with pale blue shutters and an old wooden porch facing the bay. Nothing extravagant. Just peaceful. I planted tomatoes in the backyard. Started taking slow evening walks again. Sometimes I sat near the marina for hours simply watching gulls circle above the water. No chaos. No criticism. No tension waiting beneath conversations. Just peace. And after years inside military structures and emotionally exhausting relationships, peace felt almost sacred. Daniel tried contacting me twice after the retirement ceremony. I never answered. Not from anger, from closure. There was nothing left to discuss. I later heard his business continued struggling after several investigations into financial misconduct expanded. Linda apparently blamed everyone except herself. But honestly, I stopped caring. That surprised me most of all. Because true healing begins the moment revenge stops feeling important. I still think about that wedding sometimes. The music stopping. The slap. The humiliation. The stunned faces around the ballroom. But strangely, those memories no longer feel like the ending of my story. They feel like the beginning of my freedom. And maybe that's the lesson I carry forward now. Sometimes life humiliates us publicly because we ignored private truths for too long. Pain has a way of forcing honesty into places comfort once protected. If you're listening to my story today while sitting in a quiet house, or recovering from heartbreak, or wondering whether peace is still possible later in life, please hear this from someone who learned it the hard way. It is never too late to stop abandoning yourself. Not at 40, not at 60, not ever. And if this story meant something to you, if part of it reminded you of your own life, your own strength, or your own second chance, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need that reminder too. Sometimes, one story can help another person finally choose themselves. The folder slid across the Christmas table so softly it almost made no sound at all. Daniel's mother pushed it with 2 fingers right between the dish of candied yams and the basket of dinner rolls, as if she were offering me something polite. Her smile stayed in place, neat and cold. "We think this is best," she said, before the wedding moves forward. For a second, nobody moved. The lights on the tree in the corner blinked red gold, red gold. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer ticked. Daniel looked down at his plate. His father folded his hands like this was a business meeting instead of Christmas dinner. His sister took a sip of wine and tried not to look interested. I rested my hand on the folder but did not open it right away. Even before I saw the title on the first page, I knew what it was. A contract. Not the kind people use when they want fairness, the kind they use when they want to remind you where they think you belong. By then, I had spent nearly 20 years in the Marine Corps. I had stood in rooms where generals made decisions that carried the weight of life and death. I had buried good men. I had written letters to families. I had learned how power worked, and more important, how small people acted when they believed someone else had none. Still sitting at that Christmas table in my oldest wool coat, I felt something sharper than anger. Not because of the paper. Because Daniel had known. I could see it in the way he would not lift his eyes. That was the moment. That was the night. That was the second I understood that before I married this man, I needed to decide whether love was enough when courage was missing. But that was not where the story began. It began 3 weeks earlier on a gray December morning with Daniel standing in my kitchen holding a mug of coffee and smiling at me like the world was still simple. "I want you to come to Christmas dinner," he said. "My parents are finally ready to meet you properly." I was standing at the counter in stocking feet reading an early briefing packet before heading to base. The townhouse I owned in a quiet neighborhood outside Quantico was warm, plain, and tidy. No expensive art, no dramatic furniture, no sign to an ordinary eye that the woman living there earned a solid military salary and carried a rank most men twice her age never reached. I kept my life that way on purpose. Daniel thought I worked in an administrative office connected to the base. He had never said the word clerk with disrespect. In fact, he always said it kindly as though he admired that I was steady and unpretentious. He believed I handled paperwork reports, scheduling, something small, something quiet. I had let him believe that. Not because I enjoyed deceit, I did not. But after years of being saluted, deferred to studied and judged by rank, I had grown hungry for the one thing authority never seemed to bring me: unguarded affection. I wanted one person in my life who saw me before he saw the stars on my collar. So I had never corrected him. I was 38 years old, a major general in the United States Marine Corps with responsibilities that would have startled him if he had known them all. My monthly pay was a little over $18,000 before taxes and deductions. I had my own home, my own retirement, my own investments, and enough savings that I could have walked away from the service tomorrow and lived modestly for the rest of my life. But none of that interested me half as much as character did. "Properly?" I asked. Daniel laughed. "You know what I mean." I looked up from the packet. "I thought I'd already met them properly." "You met them at that fundraiser for 10 minutes and my mother was distracted," he said. "This will be different. Just family, Christmas, relaxed." I remember the little pause I took before answering. Daniel noticed it too. "What?" he asked. "Your mother didn't seem distracted," I said. "She seemed disappointed." He gave me that helpless half-smile of his, the one meant to smooth over discomfort without ever truly facing it. "She just doesn't know you yet." That was Daniel's way. He was a good man in many of the daily, ordinary senses. He remembered how I took my coffee. He checked the oil in my car without telling me. He took his suit jackets to the dry cleaner on time and sent flowers to widows from church. He called his aunt every Sunday. He would bring in my grocery bags without being asked. But Daniel had been raised in a family where keeping the peace mattered more than speaking plain truth. Around his parents especially, he softened himself into someone smaller. He did not lie exactly. He just let things go unchallenged until they hardened into facts. "When is dinner?" I asked. "Christmas Eve," he said. "My sister and her husband will be there too." I set down the packet and turned fully toward him. "And what exactly have you told them about me?" His eyebrows lifted too quickly. "That you work on base." "That's all." He shrugged, more or less. It would have been easy then to tell him. To say, "Daniel, I am not an office clerk. I am a Marine Corps Major General, and if your parents want to know whether I can support myself, the answer is yes." But something in me resisted. Not pride, curiosity. By then, I had spent enough time around wealth, real wealth inherited, wealth, anxious wealth, to know that many people were not measured by what they had, but by how they treated those who seemed to have less. Daniel's family came from old East Coast comfort. Not dynastic riches, but the sort of money that lived in country club memberships, careful haircuts, and a belief that family reputation had to be protected from embarrassment. I had watched women like his mother my whole life, sweet voice, sharp eyes, generous in public, exacting in private. And I suddenly knew I wanted to see something clearly before I married her son. "All right," I said, "I'll come." He smiled with relief and came over to kiss my forehead. "You'll see, it'll be nice." I smiled back, but I did not answer. After he left for work, I stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment, the packet forgotten my coffee cooling in my hand. Then I went upstairs, opened my closet, and looked past the tailored coats and good wool dresses I wore for formal military functions when appropriate. I chose the oldest coat I owned. Brown wool. Still decent, but worn thin at the cuffs. A coat my mother would have called respectable, and other women might have called tired. My mother had raised me in a small town in North Carolina. My father died when I was young, and my mother worked in the county records office for 26 years, wearing sensible shoes, and keeping every receipt in an envelope marked by month. She used to tell me, a person with good character doesn't need to announce herself. The world will eventually do the announcing for her. She also used to say, if you really want to know who people are, let them think you can't do a thing for them. I heard her voice that morning as clear as church bells. So I made a decision. I would go to Christmas dinner dressed plainly. No jewelry beyond my watch, no polished authority, no hints. I would keep my voice soft, answer briefly, and let them decide who I was. Not because I wanted revenge. Not yet. Because I wanted truth. The weeks before Christmas passed in the usual blur of duty and December obligations. There were ceremonies, budget meetings, personnel reviews, and the annual ache that settles over military communities during the holidays, when everyone is mindful of who is deployed, who is grieving, who is coming home, and who is not. In public, I carried myself as I always did, calm, direct, self-contained. On base, people stood when I entered a room. Men twice my age chose their words carefully around me. In one afternoon, I might approve travel review, a disciplinary recommendation, and call the widow of a staff officer. By evening, I was home watering a small fern near my living room window and heating soup on the stove. It suited me. Daniel came by often. We decorated my little artificial Christmas tree one Sunday afternoon. He brought peppermint bark from a local shop. He talked about his office Christmas party, his niece's choir concert, his mother's obsession with the table setting this year. She has special china she only uses on Christmas Eve, he said. My dad carves the ham like it's a ceremony. Sounds lovely, I said. He hesitated. You're nervous? No, I said. I'm observant. He laughed, but something in his face tightened. A few nights later, he was flipping through channels in my living room when he said too casually, if my parents ask about your future, don't take it personally. I looked over from the armchair where I was mending a loose button on a cardigan. What does that mean? You know, they're practical people. Practical about what? He shifted. Marriage, finances, stability. I threaded the needle slowly. Daniel, do your parents think I'm unstable? No, he sat up. Not unstable, just they like to know where things stand. That was the second warning. Enough that any sensible woman would have pressed harder. I did not. I only nodded and kept sewing. The afternoon of Christmas Eve was bright and cold. I dressed carefully in the role I had chosen. Dark skirt, plain blouse, low heels, my oldest coat, no earrings, no makeup beyond what was necessary not to look tired. I pinned my hair simply and left it that way. When I looked in the mirror, I saw exactly what I wanted them to see. A quiet woman, pleasant enough, forgettable if you were foolish. Daniel picked me up just before 5. He was wearing a navy sweater and looked handsome in the open, earnest way that had first drawn me to him. He carried a pie I had baked and complimented my coat, which told me he truly did not see what I was doing. On the drive to his parents' house, Christmas lights glowed across front porches and shrubs. Maryland suburbs at Christmas time have a particular kind of order to them, wreaths on every other door, neat lawns gone brown for winter candles glowing in front windows, the feeling that people are trying very hard to produce warmth on schedule. Daniel reached over and touched my hand. Thank you for doing this. Of course, I said. You'll like them more once you know them. I turned my face toward the passing dark outside the window. Maybe. Their house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, large without being vulgar. White columns, green shutters, brass lantern by the door. The sort of place that had hosted many holidays and wanted you to notice it had done so successfully. Daniel parked in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see the glow of a tall tree and the movement of figures inside. I took one breath, then another. Not because I was afraid of them, because I knew with the strange stillness that sometimes comes before a storm that this night was going to tell me something final. Daniel came around to open my door, pie in one hand, smile in place. I stepped out, buttoned my old coat against the cold, and walked with him to the front porch. From inside, I could already hear laughter. Then the door opened. The woman who opened the door smiled the way people do when they've already made up their mind. Daniel, she said warmly, leaning in to kiss his cheek. Then her eyes moved to me, quick and measuring. And this must be you. Her voice lingered on the last word just a fraction too long. Mom, this is Daniel began. I remember, she said, cutting him off gently. We met briefly. She stepped aside to let us in. The house was exactly what I expected: polished hardwood floors, a tall Christmas tree dressed in gold and glass, the faint scent of cinnamon and baked ham in the air. Everything was arranged just so the way people arrange a life they want others to admire. Take your coat, she said, reaching for mine. I hesitated for the smallest moment, then let her. Her fingers brushed the sleeve, and I saw the almost invisible flicker in her expression when she felt the worn wool. Not disgust, not quite, just confirmation. She hung it carefully as though it might shed. This way, she said. We moved into the living room where Daniel's father stood near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel. He was a tall man in his 70s, straight-backed, with the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of believing he has earned his place in every room. Dad, Daniel said, this is... Yes, yes, his father replied, extending his hand to me. Welcome. His grip was firm, his smile practiced. His eyes, like his wife's, did their work quickly, taking in my clothes, my shoes, my posture. Good to finally have you here, he added. Thank you for inviting me, I said. Behind him, a younger woman approached, carrying a glass of wine, Daniel's sister. She was dressed beautifully, her hair done, her smile bright in a way that felt rehearsed. So this is the mystery woman, she said lightly. I've heard so much. I doubted that. Her husband followed a step behind, quieter, observing. Can I get you something to drink? Daniel's mother asked. Water would be fine, I said. Just water, the sister asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. It's Christmas. I'm driving later, I said. That wasn't entirely true, but it was simple. His mother returned with a glass of water and handed it to me with careful politeness. Dinner will be ready in a few minutes. Why don't we sit? We moved into the living room. Conversation began easily enough, but not naturally. Questions came my way, but they were shaped in a certain direction. So Daniel tells us you work on base, his father said, settling into his chair. Yes, I said. What kind of work, he asked. Administrative, I answered. He nodded slowly, as if placing that into a category he understood completely. That must be steady, he said. It is, I replied. His sister leaned forward slightly. Do you enjoy it? I value the structure, I said. That seemed to satisfy her, or at least confirm whatever she had already decided. Daniel tried to keep the conversation moving. He talked about work, about a project he was finishing, about a trip they might take in the spring. His mother listened, smiling at him, nodding her attention warm and full when it rested on her son. When it returned to me, it cooled. And your family, she asked. My mother passed a few years ago, I said. I don't have any siblings. Oh, she said softly, tilting her head. That must be difficult. It was, I said. There was a pause, not of sympathy, of recalibration. Less family, less support, less structure. His father cleared his throat. Well, it's good you have Daniel now. I took a sip of water. Yes, I said evenly. It is. Dinner was announced a moment later, and we moved into the dining room. The table was set beautifully. White china with a delicate gold rim. Crystal glasses. Cloth napkins folded just so. A centerpiece of pine branches and candles. It was the kind of table my mother would have admired and then quietly worried about scratching. We took our seats. Daniel sat beside me, his parents across, his sister and her husband at either end. The meal began with grace. His father bowed his head and gave thanks for family, for blessings for the year behind and the year ahead. His words were sincere, practiced, and complete. When he finished, everyone lifted their heads. Please, his mother said, eat. The food was good, very good. Ham glazed perfectly, sweet potatoes rich and soft, green beans with almonds, rolls warm and light, everything prepared with care. But the conversation never settled. So his mother said after a few minutes, turning to me again, Do you plan to continue working after the wedding? Yes, I said. In the same position, she asked. For now, I replied. She nodded, exchanging a brief glance with her husband. I only ask, she continued, because Daniel has worked very hard to build a certain lifestyle. Stability is important. I agree, I said. His sister smiled faintly. Of course, sometimes priorities shift after marriage. Sometimes, I said. Daniel shifted beside me. I could feel the tension in his arm. They're just trying to get to know you, he murmured quietly. I understand, I said. His father set down his fork. And what about long-term plans, he asked. Savings, retirement, those sorts of things. I have a plan, I said. He smiled thinly. I'm sure you do. It's just that, well, these things matter more when two people are building a life together. Yes, I said again, they do. There it was. Not outright insult, not yet. But the steady shaping of a narrative. A woman with modest means, limited prospects, a potential risk. Daniel tried to shift the subject again, but his mother brought it back. We've seen situations before, she said, her tone gentle but firm, where intentions are good, but differences in background can create complications. I looked at her. What kind of complications? Oh, she said lightly, expectations, financial habits, responsibilities. And how those are shared, his father added. I folded my hands in my lap. Shared how? His mother smiled, equitably. The word hung in the air. Daniel cleared his throat. Mom, it's a reasonable conversation, she said. Yes, I said calmly, it is. And then it happened. His father leaned back slightly. His mother reached beside her chair. The room quieted in a way that had nothing to do with the food. She placed a folder on the table, and with 2 fingers she slid it toward me. We think this is best, she said, before the wedding moves forward. This time I did not wait. I opened it. The first page was exactly what I expected. A prenuptial agreement. But as I read, I saw more than legal language. I saw assumptions. That I would contribute little, that I might depend, that I might take, that I needed to be managed before I could become part of their family. I read each line carefully. No one spoke. When I reached the end of the first page, I turned it. There were notes in the margin, in his mother's handwriting. Important, must discuss before venue deposit. I closed the folder slowly, and only then did I look up. Daniel was staring at his plate. He hadn't said a word. I rested my hands lightly on the table, and for the first time that evening I allowed a small silence to settle. Not the silence of discomfort. The silence of understanding. They thought this was about money. They thought this was about protection. They thought I was the risk. I looked at Daniel, then at his parents, and I realized something with perfect clarity. This was not the moment I had been invited into their family. This was the moment they had decided who I was allowed to be. They had just made their move. They had no idea they had just chosen the wrong woman. I let the silence sit a moment longer than most people would have. Long enough for discomfort to settle into the room. Long enough for each of them to wonder how I would react. Then I placed my fingertips lightly on the edge of the folder and said very calmly, "When was this drafted?" Daniel's mother straightened a fraction, a few weeks ago. I turned my eyes to Daniel. You knew about it. He swallowed. We talked about it. I didn't think. You didn't think I should be told I asked? It's not like that, he said quickly. I just didn't want to upset you before the holidays. His father leaned forward slightly. There's no need to make this adversarial. This is simply a precaution. Standard, really. Standard for whom I asked. For families in our position, he said. I nodded once as if that answered something. And what position is that I asked? His sister shifted in her seat. Dad just means people who have something to protect. I see, I said. I opened the folder again, flipping back to the first page. And you believe I do not. No one answered that directly? Daniel's mother offered a soft, measured smile. We don't know enough about your financial situation. That's exactly the point. These things are best clarified ahead of time. Clarified, I repeated. I turned another page, scanning the language. Separate property clauses, limitations on claims, provisions that read less like mutual protection and more like a line drawn in advance. And who drafted this, I asked. Our family attorney, his father said. For both parties, I asked. A pause. Well, he said our attorney prepared the initial document. You would, of course, be free to have your own counsel review it. Of course, I said quietly. I closed the folder again and rested my hands on top of it. Daniel reached for his water glass and took a sip he didn't seem to need. His hand trembled just slightly. It's not personal, he said. They would ask this of anyone. I turned my head slowly and looked at him. Would you? I asked. He hesitated. That's not fair, he said. No, I agreed, it isn't. His mother leaned in her tone, still gentle but firmer now. We are not accusing you of anything. We are simply being responsible. Marriage is not just emotional, it is practical. I agree, I said. Her smile returned relieved. Then you understand. I understand that you believe you are being practical, I said. What I am still trying to understand is what exactly you believe you are protecting your son from. The words landed more directly than anything I had said so far. His father's expression tightened. From complications, he said, from misunderstandings, from situations that become difficult to unwind later. Difficult for whom, I asked. For everyone involved, he replied. I nodded again as though this were a conversation I was taking seriously. Because I slid the folder a few inches back toward myself, not rejecting it, not accepting it, simply holding it in place. And Daniel, I said, turning back to him, you agreed to this. I didn't agree, he said quickly. I just didn't stop it. That's the same thing, I said. He flinched slightly like a man who has just realized the weight of a small decision. I let the silence return just for a breath. Then I asked very evenly, what is the current value of Daniel's trust? The question shifted the air in the room immediately. His father blinked. I'm sorry. You mentioned protection, I said. I assume that includes existing assets. So I'm asking, what is the current value of his trust? Daniel's sister gave a short, surprised laugh. That's a little direct, don't you think? I'm being practical, I said. His father's mouth tightened. That's not something we discuss casually. And yet you are asking me to sign a legal document that would affect my future based on that information, I said. So I don't see how it can remain undisclosed. No one spoke for a moment. I continued, my tone unchanged. Is the house in Daniel's name or held in a family trust? That's not relevant, his father said. It is if we are discussing marital property, I replied. Daniel shifted in his chair. We don't need to go into all that tonight. We don't, I asked. His mother stepped in quickly. This is exactly why we wanted to have this conversation early, so that expectations are clear. Clear for whom, I asked again. Her smile thinned. I let my gaze move across the table, taking in each of them in turn. I'm also curious, I said, about Daniel's outstanding liabilities. Daniel's head snapped up. What? You have a credit line connected to the business you started 2 years ago, I said. Is that fully resolved? The color drained from his face. His sister looked at him sharply. What is she talking about? It's nothing, Daniel said quickly. It's handled. Is it? I asked, still calm. His father frowned. How would you know about that? I met his eyes. Because I listen, I said. The room had gone very still now. No one was eating anymore. The tree lights blinked quietly in the corner. Daniel stared at me, something like confusion and fear mixing behind his eyes. Why are you doing this? He asked. I considered that for a moment. Because you asked me to take this seriously, I said. His mother set her fork down carefully. This feels unnecessary. Does it? I asked. Yes, she said. We are trying to approach this in a respectful, structured way. And I am responding in the same way, I said. Her expression hardened just a fraction. You are being defensive, she said. I am being thorough, I replied. His father leaned back in his chair, studying me now with a different kind of attention. What exactly do you do on base? He asked. There it was. Not curiosity. Recalculation. I held his gaze. More than filing paperwork, I said. Daniel let out a quiet breath. Can we just slow down for a second? No, I said gently. I don't think we should. He looked at me startled. Because this moment matters, I continued. And if we move past it too quickly, we'll pretend it didn't happen the way it actually did. His mother folded her hands in front of her. We have treated you with respect, she said. I looked at her for a long moment. No, I said quietly, you have treated me with caution. The difference seemed to land. No one spoke. I rested my hand lightly on the folder again. You are not wrong to want clarity, I said. You are not wrong to want fairness. Those are reasonable things. His father's shoulders relaxed slightly as though he thought we were moving toward agreement. But fairness requires information, I continued, on both sides. I slid the folder a little farther back toward the center of the table. And right now, I said, you don't have mine. Daniel's mother frowned. Then perhaps this is the time to share it. I looked at her. Then at Daniel. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute certainty. They still believed this conversation was happening on their terms. They still believed they were setting the conditions. They still believed I was the one who needed to prove something. I took a slow breath. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to consider what would happen next. Not as a reaction, as a decision. I straightened slightly in my chair, and I said very calmly, "All right. All right," I said again a little more firmly this time, so there would be no misunderstanding. I folded my hands neatly on top of the contract. If we're going to have a serious conversation about fairness, then we should do it properly. Daniel's mother nodded once relieved, as if she believed I was finally stepping into the role she had prepared for me. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what we're asking." I looked at Daniel first. Before I answer anything else, I said I need to understand something. He met my eyes uneasy. "Okay. Why didn't you stop this?" I asked. He swallowed. "I told you I didn't want to cause a scene." "A scene?" I repeated quietly. "I thought if we just got through dinner we could talk about it later, privately, without all this." "All this," I said, glancing at the folder, was already decided. "The only thing you postponed was telling me." He didn't answer. I let that settle between us. Then I turned to his parents. "You said you want clarity," I continued, "so let me offer you some." I sat back slightly in my chair, not in defiance, but in composure. "I am 38 years old," I said. "I have supported myself since I was 18. I do not carry personal debt. I own my home. I maintain my own retirement accounts. I do not depend on Daniel for financial stability, and I do not require access to your family's assets to live comfortably." Daniel's sister blinked, surprised. His father's eyes narrowed, reassessing. "And as for my work," I added, "you are correct that I am on base." I paused just long enough for the weight of that understatement to register. "But not in the way you've assumed." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" I looked at him. Then I looked at his parents. And I spoke plainly. "I am a Major General in the United States Marine Corps." For a moment no one reacted. It was too far outside what they expected. Then his sister let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I'm sorry, what?" "I am a 2-star general," I said, my voice calm even. "I command personnel, oversee operations, and make decisions that carry legal, financial, and human consequences. My responsibilities extend well beyond administrative duties." Daniel stared at me. "You're serious," he said. "Yes." His mother's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something sharper. That's not something one would hide." "I didn't hide it," I said. "I simply didn't lead with it." His father leaned forward, studying me in a way he hadn't before. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then why? Why am I sitting here in an old coat I finished for him?" He didn't answer. I gave him the courtesy of finishing the thought anyway. "Because I wanted to know how you would treat someone you believed had nothing to offer you." The words settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Daniel looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. "You never told me," he said quietly. No, I agreed, I didn't. "Why?" he asked. I held his gaze. "Because I wanted one relationship in my life that wasn't shaped by rank," I said. "I wanted to know if I could be known as a person before I was known as a title." His mother shook her head slightly. "This feels misleading." "Does it?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "You allowed us to believe something that wasn't true." "I allowed you to believe something you never questioned," I replied. His father sat back slowly. "And now?" he asked. "Now," I said, "we're having the conversation you wanted, with all the information on the table." I lifted the folder again, tapping it lightly. "This document," I continued, "is not inherently unreasonable. Prenuptial agreements can be useful when both parties enter them with full knowledge, independent counsel, and mutual respect." His mother nodded a bit too quickly. "Exactly." "But this," I said, opening it again and turning it so they could see, "is not that." I pointed to a clause. "This section assumes a disparity of income and restricts future claims accordingly. That assumption is incorrect." I turned another page. "This provision limits access to certain assets without disclosing their structure. That creates an imbalance of information." Another page. "And this language here," I added, tapping the margin note, "is not legal at all. It's personal. It reflects a concern about character rather than a concern about assets." Daniel's sister shifted uncomfortably. His father frowned. "Our attorney drafted that." "Your attorney drafted a document based on your perspective," I said, "not on a full understanding of both parties involved." And what would you suggest he asked? I would suggest, I said calmly, that if we are to discuss a legal agreement, it should be drafted by separate counsel with full disclosure from both sides and with terms that protect each party equally. His mother's lips pressed into a thin line. And you expect us to simply accept that she asked? I expect you to recognize that I am not the person you assumed I was, I said. The room went quiet again. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. I don't even know what to say. You could start with the truth, I said. He looked at me pained. I didn't think it mattered. It mattered to them, I said, and you let it matter without question. His father exhaled slowly. Well, he said this is unexpected. Yes, I said, it is. His mother picked up her glass of wine, took a small sip, and set it back down carefully. If what you're saying is accurate, she said, then perhaps we all made some incorrect assumptions. That's one way to put it, I replied. Her eyes met mine. And you, she added, chose not to correct them. That's also true. A long pause followed. Then she said, I suppose the question now is where we go from here. I considered that. I looked at Daniel, at his father, at his mother, at the contract still resting between us. And I realized something that had nothing to do with rank or money or legal language. This was no longer about what they thought of me. It was about what I thought of them. I closed the folder gently and set it back on the table. You asked for clarity, I said. And now you have it. For a moment after I said it, no one moved. The contract sat in the center of the table like something that had lost its purpose. Daniel's mother was the first to recover. She adjusted her napkin, smoothed it once across her lap, and lifted her chin just slightly. Well, she said, her voice carefully measured, this certainly changes the context. Does it? I asked. Her eyes flickered, not expecting that answer. Of course it does. We were operating under a certain understanding. Yes, I said, you were. His father leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. You have to admit, he said, most people would have disclosed something like that. Most people lead with whatever they think will secure their position, I replied. I chose not to. Daniel looked between us, his face pale. I still don't understand, he said. Why didn't you tell me, not just them, me? I turned to him fully. Because I needed to know who I was building a life with, I said. Not who you would become if you knew my rank. That's not fair, he said. No, I said quietly. What happened tonight wasn't fair. He flinched at that. His sister shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable now. Okay, but this feels like a test, she said. Like you set this up. I didn't set anything up, I said. I accepted an invitation. And showed up pretending to be someone else, she said. I held her gaze. I showed up without announcing myself. There was a difference. His mother exhaled slowly. Regardless, she said, we are where we are. And we still need to discuss the future. I nodded once. We do. She leaned forward slightly, regaining some of her composure. Then, let's be practical. If you truly are in the position you claim, then you understand the importance of structure. Agreements, boundaries. I do, I said. Then you must also understand that families like ours are not unique, I said, gently cutting her off. Her lips pressed together. I have spent my entire adult life working with people from every background you can imagine, I continued. Wealthy, poor, educated, not. What distinguishes them is not what they have. It's how they behave when they believe no one is watching. No one spoke. Daniel stared down at his hands. I shifted my attention back to him. Daniel, I said, my tone softer now, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. He looked up. When your parents decided to present this tonight, I said, tapping the folder lightly, did you agree with them? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I thought it was reasonable, he said finally, just as a precaution. Even knowing what you know about me, I asked. He hesitated. I didn't know this, he said, gesturing slightly toward me, toward everything I had just revealed. No, I said, but you knew me. That landed harder. He looked down again. I didn't think they were trying to hurt you, he said quietly. That's not what I asked, I replied. Silence stretched between us. Then slowly he said, I didn't stop them. I nodded once. That's what I needed to know. His mother leaned in quickly. Daniel was trying to keep the peace, she said. You can't fault him for that. I turned my head toward her. Yes, I said, I can. Her eyes widened slightly. Keeping the peace I continued at the expense of someone else's dignity is not peace. It's avoidance. His father shifted in his chair. Now hold on, he said. No one intended to compromise your dignity. I met his gaze. You handed me a document designed to limit my place in your family before you understood who I was, I said. You made assumptions about my character based on what I wore, what I said, and what you believed I could offer. That's not his sister began. It is, I said, still calm. The room fell quiet again. I let it. Then I did something none of them expected. I reached down, slipped the engagement ring from my finger, and placed it gently on the table beside the contract. The small sound it made against the wood seemed louder than anything else that night. Daniel's head snapped up. What are you doing? He asked. I'm pausing, I said. Pausing. His voice cracked slightly. You're taking the ring off in front of my family and calling it a pause. Yes, I said. Why? He demanded. I looked at him not unkindly. Because I don't know if you're ready to stand beside me, I said, and I'm not willing to build a marriage on uncertainty. His mother's face tightened. This is an overreaction, she said. No, I replied, it's a decision. His father leaned forward, his voice firmer now. You're going to walk away from an engagement over a conversation. I'm stepping back, I corrected him, because of what that conversation revealed. Daniel shook his head, disbelief and hurt written across his face. You could have told me, he said again. And you could have trusted me, I said. That was the truth at the center of it. Not the contract. Not the dinner. Trust. I stood slowly smoothing my skirt. Thank you for the meal, I said to his parents, my voice steady. It was very well prepared. His mother stared at me speechless now. I picked up my coat from the chair where it had been placed earlier. The worn wool felt heavier in my hands than it had when I arrived. Before I turned to leave, I looked at Daniel one last time. I meant what I said, I told him. This isn't the end, but it's not the beginning anymore either. He didn't move. None of them did. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the cold December night. The air hit my face sharp and clean. Behind me, I heard the door close. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to feel it. Not anger. Not triumph. Loss. Because sometimes the hardest part of seeing people clearly is realizing they're not who you hoped they were. The first few days after Christmas were the quietest I could remember in years. Not the kind of quiet you get after a long day's work when you sit down with a cup of tea and let the world settle. This was a deeper kind, the kind that leaves space for thoughts you've been too busy to face. I went back to base on the morning of the 26th. The routine helped. There were briefings waiting, reports that needed review, a personnel issue that had been delayed over the holiday. In my world, decisions didn't pause because it was Christmas. People still depended on clarity, on direction, on someone willing to take responsibility. So I stepped back into that role without hesitation. In uniform, everything made sense. People stood when I entered a room. Conversations tightened. Information was presented directly. No one wondered what I contributed or whether I belonged at the table. My authority wasn't a question, it was a fact. There is comfort in that even if you don't admit it. But when I came home in the evenings, the silence returned. My townhouse felt larger than it had before. The small artificial tree still stood in the corner of the living room, lights unplugged, now ornaments, catching the faint glow from the street lamp outside. The pie Daniel had brought was still on the counter the first night. I threw it away the next morning. I didn't hear from him right away. That didn't surprise me. Daniel was not a man who rushed into difficult conversations. He approached them the way some people approach cold water, slowly, carefully hoping to adjust before fully stepping in. On the third day he called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short. I'm sorry, he said. I don't even know where to start, but I'm sorry. Please call me when you're ready. I listened to it once, then I deleted it. Not out of anger. Out of discipline. I had learned over the years that immediate responses often come from emotion, not clarity, and I wanted to understand what I felt before I tried to explain it to him. A week passed. Work filled most of it. Meetings, reviews, long hours that blurred into one another. There were moments when I forgot entirely about Christmas dinner, about the contract, about the look on Daniel's face when I placed the ring on the table. But then something small would bring it back. A couple holding hands in a parking lot, a wedding announcement in the paper, a Christmas card left unopened on my kitchen counter. By the second week, the calls stopped. Instead, a letter arrived. It was handwritten. I recognized his handwriting immediately, careful, slightly slanted the way he always wrote grocery lists. I set it on the table and looked at it for a long time before opening it. When I finally did, I read it slowly. He didn't try to defend himself. That was the first thing I noticed. He wrote about that night, about what he had seen and what he had failed to see. He admitted that he had known about the contract and had convinced himself it was just a formality. He admitted that he had been more concerned with avoiding conflict than with protecting me. I thought I was being reasonable, he wrote. I thought I was keeping things smooth. I didn't realize I was letting you walk into something unfair. He paused there, then continued. I also didn't realize how much I liked the version of you I thought I knew. That line made me stop. He went on to explain it. He said it had been easier to feel steady, confident, even a little important beside someone he believed needed him. That he had never asked deeper questions about my work because he didn't want to disturb that balance. I'm not proud of that, he wrote, but it's true. I set the letter down for a moment and stared out the window. There it was. Not just an apology. Understanding. That mattered more than anything he could have said in the first few days. The next letter came 4 days later. This one was shorter. I've started seeing someone, he wrote, a counselor. I don't think I know how to handle my parents the way I should. I want to learn. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He just told me what he was doing. That mattered too. By the third week, I had 3 letters. Each one a little clearer than the last. He wrote about his childhood, about the way his parents made decisions, about how disagreement was handled, not through open conflict, but through quiet pressure. He wrote about how he had learned to keep peace by stepping aside rather than standing up. I thought that was maturity, he wrote. I'm starting to see it was avoidance. I read that line twice. Then I folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others. I didn't respond. Not yet. Around that same time, I received a call I hadn't expected. Daniel's mother. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. Hello. There was a brief pause on the other end. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said. You're not, I replied. Another pause. I wanted to follow up, she said, choosing her words carefully. About Christmas. Yes, I said. I believe things may have been misunderstood, she continued. I leaned back slightly in my chair. In what way, I asked. We were trying to be responsible, she said, and perhaps the way we approached it was too direct. Directness wasn't the issue, I said. She hesitated. What was the issue in your view, she asked. Assumption, I said. Silence. Then more quietly, I see. I wasn't sure she did. I also wanted to say, she added, that we were not aware of your position. I understand that, I said. And had we known, she continued, we would have handled things differently. I let that sit for a moment. Would you, I asked. She didn't answer right away. I would hope so, she said finally. That was honest in its way. Then perhaps the issue wasn't information, I said. It was perspective. Another silence. I suppose, she said slowly, there is some truth in that. We ended the call shortly after. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was movement. The real change came a few days later. A letter arrived from Daniel's father. Typed, not handwritten. Brief. I misjudged you, it read. Not because of what you withheld, but because of what I assumed. That is my responsibility. I regret the way that manifested. No explanations. No excuses. Just that. I read it once. Then I set it aside. It was enough. Not to repair everything, but to acknowledge something had been broken. The following week, I called Daniel. We agreed to meet. Not at his parents' house. Not at mine. At a small diner just off the highway. The kind of place where the coffee is always hot, the booths are worn, and no one pays much attention to who you are. It felt right. When I walked in, he was already there. He stood when he saw me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "Thank you for coming." I nodded. And for the first time since Christmas, we sat down across from each other, with nothing between us. He looked thinner. Not in a way most people would notice right away, but I saw it. The lines around his eyes were a little deeper. His shoulders didn't sit as easily as they used to. There was something in his posture less certain, more deliberate. He waited until I had settled into the booth before he sat down again. A waitress came over, poured coffee for both of us without asking, and left us with 2 menus we didn't need. "Thank you for coming," he said again. "You said that already," I replied, not unkindly. "I know," he gave a small, nervous smile. "I just didn't want to assume." "That's new," I said. He nodded. "I'm trying." We let that sit for a moment. Outside, cars moved steadily along the road. Inside, the quiet hum of conversation and clinking dishes created a kind of privacy that didn't feel forced. Around us, older couples leaned toward each other, sharing stories, finishing meals they had probably ordered the same way for years. It grounded the moment. Daniel wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "I read your face that night," he said. "After the contract, I knew something had changed. I just didn't understand what." "You understand now?" I asked. He nodded slowly. More than I did. Not completely, but enough to know I was wrong. I didn't respond right away. He continued. "I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal," he said, "that it was just paperwork, that everyone does it." "Everyone doesn't," I said. "I know that now." He paused. "It wasn't the contract, was it?" "No," I said, "it wasn't." "It was me," he said. "It was what you didn't do," I corrected gently. He looked down at the table. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "A lot." I waited. "I always thought I was a good man," he continued, "and in a lot of ways I still think I am. But I've started to realize that being good when things are easy doesn't mean much." "No," I said quietly, "it doesn't." He met my eyes. "I didn't stand up for you," he said. "Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want to deal with my parents. I told myself I'd fix it later privately, but by then the damage was already done." "Yes," I said. "I'm sorry," he said. I believed him. But belief, I had learned, was not the same as trust. "What have you done since then?" I asked. He seemed relieved by the question, grounded by it. "I've been seeing a counselor," he said, like I wrote, twice a week at first, now once. I nodded. "I didn't realize how much of my life I've spent trying to keep things smooth," he went on. "How much I avoid conflict, especially with my parents." "That's not uncommon," I said. "I know," he replied, "but it's not something I want to keep doing." He took a breath. "I met with a lawyer too," he added. "Not my parents' attorney, my own." That caught my attention. And I asked. He explained what a fair agreement actually looks like, Daniel said. Mutual disclosure, separate representation, terms that protect both people, not just one. "That's correct," I said. I didn't know that he admitted, I just assumed my parents did. "Assumption seems to run in your family," I said. He gave a small, rueful smile. "Yeah, I've noticed." We sat quietly for a moment, both of us absorbing what had been said. Finally, he looked at me again. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said. "Not yet. I know I don't have that right." I appreciated that. "I just wanted you to know I'm working on it," he continued. "On myself, on how I handle things, on how I show up." I studied him. He wasn't trying to persuade me. He wasn't trying to charm his way back into place. He was simply telling the truth as he understood it. That was new. "What about your parents?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "That's been harder," he said. "But I've started setting boundaries." "In what way?" "I told them I wouldn't discuss our relationship unless you were present," he said. "And that if we ever move forward again, decisions like that," he nodded toward the invisible memory of the contract, "won't happen without both of us involved from the beginning." "And how did they respond?" I asked. "My mom was upset," he admitted. "My dad didn't say much at first, but he wrote you that letter." "I received it," I said. He nodded. "He doesn't apologize easily," Daniel said. "That was a lot for him." "I know," I said. We fell into another quiet. The waitress came back, refilled our coffee, and asked if we wanted anything else. We both shook our heads. When she left, Daniel spoke again. "I don't expect you to trust me right now," he said. "I just want the chance to become someone you can trust again." I let that sit between us. Outside, a truck passed its headlights, sweeping briefly across the window. "Trust isn't something you ask for," I said finally. "It's something you build." "I know," he said. "And it takes time," I added. "I have time," he replied. I looked at him for a long moment. There was no certainty in what I felt. No clear answer. But there was something else. Possibility. "I'm not ready to decide anything today," I said. "I understand," he said. "But I am willing to keep talking," I continued. Relief moved across his face, quiet but unmistakable. "Thank you," he said. I nodded once. We finished our coffee in a more comfortable silence than before. When we stood to leave, he didn't reach for my hand. He didn't try to close the distance. He simply walked beside me to the door. Outside, the air was cold again, though not as sharp as it had been on Christmas Eve. We stood there for a moment. "Same place next week?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He smiled, small and genuine. "I'll be here," he said. "I know," I replied. And as I walked to my car, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Not that everything would be easy. Not that everything would be fixed. But that sometimes people can learn. If this story made you pause even for a moment and think about how we treat others when we believe they have nothing to offer, then it's already done something meaningful. If you've ever been underestimated, or if you've ever realized you underestimated someone else, you're not alone. Stories like this remind us that respect isn't earned through titles or wealth, it's revealed through behavior. If this resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might need that reminder today. And if you'd like to hear more stories about quiet strength, second chances, and the kind of truth that changes people slowly, you're always welcome here.